She never gave an interview, never wrote a book, never sold a story to a newspaper that would have paid handsomely for what she knew. In a family that generated more press coverage than any other institution on earth, Mabel Anderson was the one person inside the nursery who said nothing, for 50 years, to anyone who was not supposed to hear it. The royal children called her Mabel, not Nanny Anderson, not Miss Anderson, not the formal address that the palace's protocol assigned to the people who worked within its walls. Mabel. The informality was not a breach of etiquette. It was the specific intimacy of children who have grown up in the care of someone who knows them more completely than anyone else in their world, who has been present for the fears and the tantrums, and the illnesses, and the small private victories that parents in public roles are not always present for, and who has earned, through that sustained presence, a form of address that no protocol was going to overrule. Charles was in her care from the beginning. Anne followed, then Andrew, then Edward. 4 children across 17 years, from the early 1950s to the late 1960s, through the years when Elizabeth was becoming a queen in the full operational sense, and Philip was navigating the specific frustrations of a man whose role the institution had designed to be secondary, and who found the design consistently inadequate to his temperament. While those 2 negotiations were proceeding in the adult world of the palace, Mabel Anderson was in the nursery, managing the daily reality of 4 children who were simultaneously ordinary children with ordinary childhood needs and the most publicly scrutinized children in the world. She understood both dimensions. The understanding was not the product of training. She had trained as a nursery nurse, which gave her the professional competence for the practical dimensions of the role, but the understanding of what it meant to raise children, who were also symbols, required something that training does not supply. It required the specific quality of attention that makes a person genuinely see who a child is, beneath the category the child has been assigned, and the willingness to serve what they see rather than what the category requires. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Charles was sensitive in a way that the palace did not know what to do with. He felt things acutely and showed it, which the institution interpreted as weakness, and which Mabel understood as a quality that required protection rather than correction. She protected it, daily, across the years of his childhood, with the particular fierceness of someone who has decided that the child in front of them is being misread by the world around them, and that the misreading has consequences. The consequences were real. They shaped a prince. They shaped, ultimately, a king. Mabel Anderson shaped him first. Before the tutors and the schools and the naval career and the marriages and the decades of public life that constructed the public Charles, before all of that, there was a woman in a nursery in Buckingham Palace who knew who he actually was and who spent the formative years of his life refusing to let the institution that surrounded him make him into something else. She never talked about it. She was never asked to talk about it in any forum that produced a public record. She existed, for most of her working life and for most of the time since, in the palace's preferred category for the people who did its most important work, acknowledged functionally, ignored historically, present in the record, as a name attached to a role, rather than as a person whose contribution to the institution's most significant output deserves the attention it has never received. 4 royal children, 50 years of service, 1 woman. The palace never found the words. The children did. They called her Mabel. Mabel Anderson came to Buckingham Palace in 1948, the year before Charles was born, hired as an under-nurse to assist Helen Lightbody, the senior nanny who had been recommended to Princess Elizabeth by the Duchess of Gloucester, and who ran the royal nursery with the particular combination of professional authority and personal rigidity that the senior nanny position in a royal household of that period was expected to embody. She was 22 years old when she arrived, a Scotswoman, from a background that the palace's formal records have never specified in the detail that would make her origins clearly locatable, trained in the nursery nursing that the Norland College and its equivalents produced in young women who had decided that the care of other people's children was a vocation rather than simply an employment. The training was professional in the way that nursery nursing was professional in the late 1940s, practical, specific, attentive to the physical and developmental needs of children across the age ranges that nursery nurses were expected to manage, and it had given Mabel Anderson the competence that the role required. What the training had not given her, and what became apparent in the years following her arrival, was the specific quality that distinguished her from the other women who had filled and would fill similar positions in the royal household. The quality was not dramatic and was not easily named by the people who observed it in her, which is possibly why it appears in the accounts of her time at the palace in terms that are more impressionistic than specific, words like warmth and steadiness and presence that gesture towards something real without quite landing on it. The something real was a capacity for seeing children, not observing them, not monitoring their development against the charts and the milestones that nursery nurse training produced, not managing their behavior within the frameworks that child-rearing orthodoxy of the period prescribed. Seeing them, the specific individuals beneath the developmental stage, the particular person rather than the representative child, the quality of character that is present from infancy and that the people who pay sufficient attention can identify and respond to before the child has the language to describe it. She paid that attention. It was the consistent quality of her professional life from the beginning, and it was what made her, in the years following Helen Lightbody's departure from the royal household in 1956, the person to whom the responsibility for the nursery was entrusted, without the formal senior nanny title that the responsibilities scale warranted. Charles was born on the 14th of November 1948, 9 months after Mabel's arrival at the palace. The timing was close enough that she was present for his earliest weeks, not as his primary carer in those first months, which was Lightbody's domain, but as the person whose daily presence in the nursery made her familiar to him before he had the capacity to understand familiarity as a concept. The attachment that formed between them across the subsequent years of his childhood was an attachment built on the accumulated experience of daily contact from the beginning, rather than on any single formative event, and its depth reflected that accumulation. The palace in 1948 was a specific institutional environment whose character shaped everyone inside it, including the people in the nursery whose daily world was both connected to and separate from the formal institutional world of the floors below. It was an institution in the process of significant transition. The old king was ill, the succession was imminent. The question of what the monarchy would look like when the young princess became queen was a question that the institution was preparing to answer without quite being able to predict the form that the answer would take. Elizabeth and Philip were young parents navigating the specific difficulty that royal parenthood has always imposed, the difficulty of being genuinely present for children whose upbringing the institution considers its own business as much as the parents' business, and whose daily care is managed by professionals whose proximity to the children inevitably exceeds the parents' proximity during the working hours that institutional obligations consume. The difficulty was not unique to Elizabeth and Philip. It was the standard condition of royal parenthood across the generations, and the standard response to it was the engagement of nursery staff whose professional competence was trusted to provide what parental presence could not consistently supply. Mabel provided what parental presence could not consistently supply, with a consistency that the palace's accounts of the period acknowledge in general terms and have never examined with the specificity that the examination would require. She was there in the mornings, for the transition from sleep that children navigate differently depending on who is present for it. She was there through the days, for the play and the meals and the small educational introductions that nursery life incorporated before the formal schooling that came later. She was there in the evenings, for the baths and the stories and the gradual management of the day's end that children require from the people they trust most completely. She was there, in short, for the daily texture of childhood, in a way and with a consistency that Elizabeth and Philip, given the demands of their public lives, were not able to match. This is not a criticism of the parents, it is a description of the structural reality of royal parenthood in the early 1950s, a reality that the institution had created and that the individuals inside it could not unilaterally alter without consequences that neither Elizabeth nor Philip was positioned to absorb at that particular moment in their lives. The coronation of June 1953 reorganized everything around it, pulling the institution's full resources toward the preparation and the execution of the ceremony that would formally establish Elizabeth as queen, in the constitutional sense that the accession 2 years earlier had established her legally. Mabel was in the nursery during the coronation, with Charles and Anne, managing the day for 2 children whose mother was being crowned in Westminster Abbey. The management of that day, the keeping of the ordinary texture of nursery life intact, while the extraordinary event proceeded around it, was not a glamorous contribution to the coronation. It was a necessary one, and it was performed with the same steady competence that characterized everything else Mabel Anderson brought to the role. Charles watched part of the coronation on television, or was present for part of it. The accounts differ in their specifics, and the difference matters less than the general picture of a 4-year-old being managed through an event whose significance he was too young to understand, and whose impact on his daily life was considerable, because the event reshaped his mother's daily life in ways that the subsequent years would make more, rather than less, apparent. Anne arrived in 1950, 18 months after Charles, and the nursery became a 2-child environment, with the dynamic that 2-child nurseries produce. The older child navigating the adjustment to sharing attention that had previously been undivided. The younger child arriving into a world that already contained a personality with established claims on the space. Mabel managed this dynamic with the attentiveness that her capacity for seeing individual children allowed, understanding that Charles's response to Anne's arrival was shaped by the specific quality of Charles's particular sensitivity and required specific management, and that Anne's character, which was apparent early as considerably more robust and more physically confident than her brother's, required a different kind of attention. The difference in the children's characters was visible from the earliest years of Anne's presence in the nursery, and it was visible to Mabel in ways that it was not always visible to the people who observed the children from greater distance. Charles felt the world with an acuity that required handling. Anne engaged with the world with a directness that required boundaries rather than protection. The management of both, simultaneously, within the same nursery environment, required the capacity to hold 2 fundamentally different approaches to childhood in mind at the same time, and to respond to each according to its own requirements, rather than according to a single uniform approach. Mabel held both. The holding was not effortless. The accounts of people who worked with her in the nursery during this period describe a professional who was deeply engaged with the specificity of each child's needs, and who found the engagement demanding in proportion to its depth. But the demand did not produce a withdrawal from the engagement. It produced a sustained, daily, considered attention to the particular individuals in her care that the children experienced as the specific warmth that children experience when the person caring for them genuinely sees who they are. Helen Lightbody left the royal household in 1956, when Charles was 7 and Anne was 5. The departure was managed with the discretion that departures from royal service are managed without public explanation, without the kind of account that would have allowed the people interested in the royal nursery to understand what the departure signified about the household's internal dynamics. What it signified, in practical terms, was that Mabel Anderson became the primary figure in the nursery, the person responsible for the daily care of Charles and Anne, and, in the years that followed, for the 2 younger children whose births extended her service across the subsequent decade. She was 29 when Lightbody left. She was not given the senior nanny title. She was given the responsibility that the title would have attached to, and the distinction between those 2 things, between the formal acknowledgement of a role and the practical requirement to perform it, was one that the palace managed with the efficiency that it brought to all such distinctions, which is to say, without examining whether the management was adequate to the contribution. It was not adequate. It never was. The inadequacy was institutional rather than personal, the product of a system that had no appropriate framework for valuing what Mabel Anderson was providing to the 4 children whose formation it had entrusted to her. The system gave her the responsibility. The system declined to give her the recognition that the responsibility warranted. The system benefited from both sides of the arrangement, with the efficiency that institutions always achieve when the person providing the benefit has decided that the providing matters more than the recognition. She had decided that. The deciding was visible in everything she did across the years that followed, and it shaped the specific character of her contribution to the institution in ways that the institution has never adequately described. The word sensitive appears in virtually every account of Charles's childhood, written by people who observed him during those years, and it appears with the particular quality of a word being used to describe something that the writer finds difficult to place within the available vocabulary of royal childhood. Sensitive is a word that contains, in the context of a mid-20th century British royal household, a range of meanings that its surface simplicity conceals. It means that the child feels things acutely, that the feelings are visible, that the visibility is considered problematic, and that the problem is understood as the child's rather than the institution's. The institution's understanding of Charles's sensitivity was shaped by the assumptions that the British royal family brought to the question of character formation in the post-war period. Assumptions formed by the military culture that Philip embodied, and that the palace's general ethos reflected. Assumptions that valued the management of feeling over its expression, that read emotional acuity as a liability requiring correction rather than a quality requiring development, and that produced an educational and social environment calibrated to produce the kind of self-contained competence that the royal role was assumed to require. Charles did not fit this calibration. He was not self-contained in the way the institution required, not in the early years of his childhood, and not in the later years when the institutional pressure to become self-contained was applied with increasing directness through the schools and the naval career and the public role that the years of formation were supposed to prepare him for. He felt the world too completely, showed the feeling too visibly, and found in the gap between what he felt and what the institution permitted him to show a source of difficulty that the palace's approach to his formation consistently deepened rather than addressed. Mabel understood this from the beginning. The understanding was not theoretical. She had no particular framework of developmental psychology to apply to what she observed in Charles, no vocabulary of emotional intelligence that the period had not yet developed into the accessible discourse it would eventually become. What she had was the observational capacity she brought to all the children in her care, applied to a specific child whose specific character produced specific observations that she responded to in specific ways. She responded by not correcting the feeling. This is the central fact of her relationship with Charles, and it is the fact that the accounts of people who observed the nursery during his childhood most consistently point toward, without always stating directly. In a household that treated the visibility of feeling as a problem requiring management, Mabel was the person who did not manage it in that direction, who received what Charles showed her without the correction that the institutional environment applied to the same showing in other contexts. The practical expression of this was in the daily texture of the nursery, in the specific ways that she structured his time and responded to his moods, and managed the transitions between activities and emotional states that children navigate and that the quality of the management shapes in ways that accumulate across the years of childhood into something fundamental. She did not rush him past the feelings that needed to be felt. She did not apply the brisk dismissiveness that the British nursery culture of the period often applied to children's emotional expression as a corrective to self-indulgence. She waited when waiting was what was needed, and she engaged when engagement was what was needed, with the specific quality of attention that his specific character required. The reading that Charles was an unhappy child has been reproduced across the decades of writing about him with enough consistency that it has acquired the character of established fact. The reading is not entirely wrong. The conditions of his childhood contained genuine sources of difficulty, including the parental absence that the Queen's public duties produced, and the specific character of his relationship with Philip, which was a relationship between a father who valued a kind of confident self-possession that his son did not naturally possess, and a son who valued a kind of engaged emotional connection that his father did not naturally provide. But the reading is also incomplete in a way that the focus on the difficulties produces. It omits the nursery. It omits the specific quality of daily life that Mabel Anderson provided across the years of Charles's childhood, the warmth, the steadiness, the consistent presence of someone who understood who he was, and whose understanding created, within the institutional environment that surrounded him, a space in which the understanding was the governing condition rather than the exception. He was not unhappy in the nursery, in the way that he was unhappy in other dimensions of his royal childhood. The nursery was the space that Mabel governed, and the space she governed was a space that accommodated who he was, rather than requiring him to be something else. The accommodation was not indulgence. She was a professional nursery nurse with clear ideas about what children needed and what the boundaries of appropriate behavior were, and she maintained those boundaries with the consistency that children require from the people who care for them to feel genuinely safe. The safety she provided was not only physical, though she provided that too. It was the specific psychological safety of being known, of existing in the daily presence of someone who has seen your character clearly and has decided, on the basis of what she has seen, that the character is worth protecting rather than reforming. Philip's relationship with the nursery was not uncomplicated. He was a father with strong views about the formation of children, particularly of sons, and the views he held about what Charles needed from his formation were views that did not align easily with the approach that Mabel's understanding of Charles produced. Philip valued action over reflection, physical confidence over emotional sensitivity, the kind of outward competence that his own formation in the naval tradition had made central to his understanding of masculine adequacy. Charles was not naturally equipped to provide these things, and the provision was not something that Mabel's management of the nursery was designed to produce, because her management was calibrated to the child she actually saw, rather than to the child that the institution's assumptions about what a royal son should be required him to become. The misalignment between what Philip wanted for Charles and what Mabel provided to Charles was not a conflict, it was a divergence, operating in different registers of the same child's daily life, and its resolution was not achieved through any direct engagement between Philip's position and Mabel's approach, but through the simple fact that Philip was not in the nursery and Mabel was. The nursery was her domain. In her domain, Charles was managed according to her understanding of him, and her understanding was more accurate than the institutional one. Anne was a different case entirely, and the difference is instructive about the quality of Mabel's attentiveness. Where Charles required protection and gentle engagement, Anne required something closer to structured challenge. She was physically brave and emotionally robust in ways that Charles was not, and she found in the nursery's domestic world a limitation that her character consistently pushed against. She wanted to be doing rather than being managed, wanted the outdoor world rather than the indoor one, wanted the horses that would become the central passion of her adult life, with an urgency that was apparent from the earliest age at which she encountered them. Mabel managed Anne's robustness with the same precision she brought to Charles's sensitivity, not by suppressing it, not by insisting that the nursery's indoor world was where Anne belonged regardless of her preference, but by finding the specific accommodation between what the nursery could provide and what Anne's character required that allowed both to coexist without either being compromised. The accommodation required daily creativity, the ongoing production of an environment that served two fundamentally different children simultaneously, without either child feeling that the service was primarily directed at the other. The fact that both children developed an attachment to Mabel that has been described, by the people who have observed or reported on those attachments across the decades since, as genuine and deep and lasting well into their adult lives, is the most direct available evidence of the quality of what the daily creativity produced. Attachments of that depth and that duration are not produced by professional competence alone. They are produced by the specific experience of being seen and known and responded to across the years of childhood, in ways that the child experiences as genuine rather than performed. Mabel was genuine. The genuineness was visible to the children, who experienced it as the specific warmth they called by her first name, and visible to the people who worked alongside her in the nursery, who described it in the careful language of people who understood that they were working in proximity to something unusual, without always having the vocabulary to specify what the unusual thing was. Andrew arrived in 1960, 12 years after Charles, when Mabel had been in the royal household for 12 years, and had developed, across those 12 years, the specific expertise in the management of this particular family's children that no amount of general professional training could have produced. He was a different child again, more boisterous than either of his older siblings, more naturally social, more inclined to the kind of physical exuberance that nursery environments both accommodate and limit, and possessed of a confidence that Charles had never had naturally, and that Anne had possessed in a more directed, purposeful form. Edward followed in 1964, the fourth and last of the children Mabel would care for, arriving when Charles was 15 and already at school, and Anne was 13, and Andrew was 4. The span of ages across the 4 children, 15 years between eldest and youngest, meant that Mabel's experience of the family was an experience of 4 entirely different childhoods rather than 4 overlapping ones, and the range of what she observed and managed across that span gave her a knowledge of the family's children that no other individual outside the immediate family possessed in comparable depth. She held that knowledge for 50 years. The holding was not passive, it was the active, daily management of professional discretion that the royal household required, and that Mabel Anderson provided with the same consistency she brought to everything else about her work. She did not share what she knew with the people who were not entitled to know it, which in the context of a royal household meant almost everyone outside the nursery's immediate world. The discretion was not simply a professional obligation. It was a form of respect for the children, for their parents, for the specific quality of the relationship that the nursery had produced, and that disclosure would have cheapened in ways that the relationship's value made intolerable. She kept the knowledge because the knowledge was theirs. That was who Mabel Anderson was, stated as plainly as 50 years of professional silence eventually allows. The question of Elizabeth and Philip's parenting has generated more commentary than almost any other dimension of the royal family's private life, and the commentary has followed a predictable arc: initial deference to the official image of a devoted family, followed by the gradual accumulation of accounts from people close to the household that complicated the image, followed by the revisionist assessments that the complications produced, followed by the counter-revisionism that the institution's defenders offered in response. The arc has not produced a settled verdict, partly because the evidence is genuinely complicated, and partly because the question of what constitutes adequate parenting is one that different observers answer differently depending on the assumptions they bring to it. What is not contested, across all the accounts and all the positions in the debate, is the basic structural fact. Elizabeth and Philip were frequently absent from their children's daily lives in ways that the demands of their public roles made unavoidable, and that the palace's management of those roles did not systematically attempt to reduce. The absences were not indifference, they were the product of an institutional arrangement that had been designed around the assumption that royal children would be cared for by professional staff, and that the parents' primary obligation was to the public role rather than to the daily texture of their children's lives. The assumption was not examined. It was inherited from the generations of royal parents who had operated within it before Elizabeth and Philip, and it was sustained by the institutional machinery that organized the royal schedule without reference to the question of whether the schedule's demands were compatible with the parenting that the children in the nursery required. Mabel Anderson was the structural consequence of this arrangement. She was the person whose presence compensated for the parental absence that the arrangement produced, not consciously positioned as compensation, not formally understood as filling a parenting gap that the institution had created, but functionally performing that role with the daily consistency that the children's needs required and that the parents' schedules did not permit the parents to provide. The 6-month Commonwealth tour of 1953 and 1954 is the episode that the accounts of the royal family's early years most consistently return to when examining the question of parental presence and absence. Elizabeth and Philip left for the tour in November 1953, 5 months after the coronation, and returned in May 1954, 6 months during which Charles was 4 and 5 years old, and Anne was 3 and 4, and during which the primary parental figures in their daily lives were Mabel Anderson and the household staff, rather than the people who had produced them. The tour was not optional in any practical sense that the individuals involved could have acted on unilaterally. It was a constitutional obligation of the newly crowned Queen. a demonstration of the Commonwealth's continued coherence around the monarchy, a physical manifestation of the Queen's relationship to the territories and peoples that the Commonwealth comprised, and a diplomatic undertaking whose cancellation or significant modification would have produced political consequences that the palace was not prepared to accept. Elizabeth understood this. Philip understood this. The understanding did not make the leaving easier, but it resolved the question of whether leaving was the right decision in a way that personal preference could not override. Charles and Anne experienced the 6 months in ways that the accounts of people close to the household during this period describe with the care of people who understand that what they are describing is both genuinely difficult and genuinely complicated. Difficult because the absence of both parents for 6 months is a substantial experience in a 4-year-old's life. And complicated because the presence of Mabel Anderson meant that the absence was managed within a context of sustained, skilled, attentive care that reduced its impact on the children's daily experience without eliminating it. She managed the 6 months with the same approach she brought to every other aspect of the nursery's operation, by keeping the daily routine as consistent as the absence allowed, by providing the physical and emotional stability that the children needed regardless of what was happening in the larger world around them, and by neither dramatizing the parents' absence nor pretending it was not happening. Children at those ages understand presence and absence without requiring explanation, and the quality of the presence that fills an absence determines much of what the absence means in the child's experience. The presence Mabel provided during those 6 months was the presence of someone who had been the constant of the children's daily lives from the beginning, and who remained constant when the parents departed. The constancy was itself a form of security, the evidence that the world the children inhabited was stable in ways that did not depend entirely on the parents' physical presence, because the most consistent figure in the daily world remained present and continued to provide what she had always provided. This is not an argument that the absence was without consequence or without cost. It is an observation that the consequence and the cost were shaped significantly by the quality of what Mabel Anderson provided in the absence's place, and that the shaping reduced the damage without eliminating it in the way that good professional care always reduces but cannot entirely prevent the consequences of structural difficulties that the care alone cannot resolve. The parents returned. The reunion was, by the accounts of people present for it, genuinely warm on all sides. Elizabeth and Philip were not cold parents, were not indifferent to their children's well-being, were not the figures of emotional unavailability that some accounts have required them to be in order to explain the difficulties of Charles's subsequent life. They were parents who found the expression of warmth complicated by the specific formation they had each received and by the institutional context that surrounded every interaction they had with their children, including the private ones. Philip's relationship with the nursery was shaped by his broader relationship with the institution he had married into, a relationship of sustained tension between his own considerable personality and the role that the institution had designed for the consort of a reigning queen, a role he found consistently inadequate, and that he navigated with the particular energy of someone who needs to be doing something significant and who has been placed in a position where the most significant available doing is the management of the appearance of not doing too much. He engaged with the children with the specific quality of attention that his character produced, direct, physically active, more comfortable with the outdoor dimensions of the children's lives than with the indoor emotional ones, better at the sailing and the polo and the outdoor pursuits that his own formation had made natural than at the quiet, contained, emotionally present engagement that Charles in particular needed from him and that the formation had not equipped him to provide consistently. Mabel observed this without commenting on it, which was the observational discipline that her position required and that her character supported. She was not positioned to mediate between Philip's approach to his children and the approach that her own understanding of the children suggested they needed. She was positioned to provide, within the nursery, what the nursery could provide, and to be, for the children, the consistent figure whose consistency was itself the answer to the inconsistencies that the larger world around them sometimes produced. Elizabeth's engagement with the nursery was shaped by the specific character of her relationship to her role. the seriousness with which she took the constitutional obligations of the monarchy, the discipline with which she managed the boundary between those obligations and her personal life, and the specific difficulty of maintaining that boundary when the personal life included children whose needs did not observe the boundary's existence. She visited the nursery regularly and engaged with the children with the warmth that the visits produced, and the visits were genuine rather than performed. She was not conducting a parental inspection, not demonstrating maternal devotion for an audience, but spending time with her children in the specific way that the schedule's constraints made possible. The constraints were real and were understood by Mabel as real. She did not hold the parental absences against the parents, did not frame the absences as indifference when the children asked questions that the absences made natural, did not insert herself into the space the absences created in a way that would have produced confusion about the nature of her role in the children's lives. She was their nanny. She held the role with clarity and with the specific wisdom of someone who understands that the clarity of roles matters to children in ways that adults who are secure in their own identities sometimes underestimate. The clarity meant that the children knew who Mabel was to them. Not a parent, not a substitute parent, but the person who was there in the ways that the daily texture of childhood required someone to be there, and whose being there was a fact of their lives as fundamental as the fact of the palace walls, and the changing of the guard, and the other constants of the specific world into which they had been born. Andrew and Edward experienced a different version of the same arrangement, the same parental structure, the same institutional constraints, the same Mabel Anderson, but at a moment when the family's internal dynamics had shifted from the early 1950s version in ways that the decade's passage and the children's growing up had produced. Charles was at school by the time Andrew was born. Anne was approaching the age at which the nursery would cede to the schoolroom. The household that Mabel managed for the two younger children was a household whose older members were already in the process of moving beyond it. The management of this transition, of children moving out of the nursery's world and into the institutional world of schools and tutors, and the formal preparation for royal life that the later years of childhood provided, was another dimension of Mabel's role that the accounts of her time at the palace have not examined with the attention it warrants. She was not simply a nursery nurse who managed young children. She was the figure who managed the transition between the nursery world and the larger world, who understood the specific vulnerability of that transition for children whose larger world was as demanding and as public as the one these particular children were moving into, and who provided the specific support that the transition required. Charles's transition was the most difficult and the most documented, because Charles's subsequent history has made the events of his formation the subject of considerable retrospective examination. The accounts of his departure for Cheam School in 1957, at the age of 8, describe a child who was not ready for the separation that boarding school imposed, and who experienced the separation with the acute sensitivity that characterized his engagement with everything that mattered to him. Mabel was not able to accompany him to Cheam. The nursery was not the school. Her role did not extend beyond the palace's walls in the formal sense. What she provided in the weeks before his departure and in the returns to the palace that the school term's interruptions produced was the consistency of the nursery world that remained available to him when he came back, the evidence that the thing he had come from was still there, still intact, still governed by the same person whose steadiness had been the condition of his security from the beginning. He came back to it, across the years of the school term's interruptions, with the specific quality of return that children make to the places where they have been most genuinely known. And it was there, and she was there, and the being there was the thing he had come back for. Philip wanted his sons to be hard. This is the simplest available summary of his position on the formation of male children in the royal household, and it is both accurate and insufficient. Accurate because the hardness he wanted was a genuine value for him rather than a performance, and insufficient because the hardness he valued was not a single quality but a cluster of related qualities that his own formation had made central to his understanding of what a man capable of functioning in the world he inhabited needed to be. The cluster included physical courage, which he possessed in abundant measure, and which his wartime naval service had tested in ways that shaped his understanding of what courage actually required. It included the capacity to suppress discomfort, physical and emotional, without the suppression becoming a damage that expressed itself sideways, which was a balance he had achieved with varying success across the decades of his own life. It included the willingness to engage with difficulty directly, rather than accommodating it, the specific form of fortitude that his generation's formation had produced in the men who had passed through it successfully, and that he considered the most reliable equipment for a life in public service. He had formed himself on these values. He wanted his sons formed on them. The wanting was genuine, and was not without wisdom. The life that Charles was going to live was a life that would require genuine fortitude, genuine capacity to function under sustained public pressure, genuine ability to manage the specific difficulties of a royal existence without the management becoming visible in ways that the public role made costly. The wisdom in Philip's position and the problem with Philip's position occupied the same space. The values he wanted to instill were values that Charles needed, and the methods Philip favored for instilling them were methods calibrated to his own character rather than to Charles's. The distinction between what a child needs and how you get them to what they need is the central distinction of child formation, and the failure to attend to it is the failure that even genuinely well-intentioned parents make when they apply to their children the formation they received themselves, without assessing whether the application fits the specific character of the child they are applying it to. Philip's formation had been applied to a person of considerable resilience, social confidence, and natural physical ease. Charles was a person of considerable sensitivity, social anxiety, and the specific difficulty that sensitive children experience in environments calibrated to a different kind of temperament. The formation that had worked for Philip was not the formation that would work for Charles, and the application of it to Charles produced, across the years of his childhood and adolescence, a sustained experience of inadequacy that the people who have written about his formation have documented with increasing directness as the evidence has accumulated. Mabel understood this. She did not understand it in the vocabulary of developmental psychology that subsequent decades would make available. She understood it in the specific, practical, observational way that someone who has spent years watching a particular child develops an understanding of what that child needs that no theoretical framework can fully approximate. What Charles needed in the daily texture of his life was an environment that acknowledged the legitimacy of his particular way of experiencing the world, that did not treat his sensitivity as a deficiency to be corrected, that did not apply to his emotional responses the brisk dismissiveness that corrective approaches produce when they are applied to children whose emotional responses are genuine expressions of a genuine character rather than performances of weakness. He needed to be met where he was, rather than directed toward where the formation thought he should be. Mabel met him where he was. This is the fact about her relationship with Charles that the accounts of people who observed the nursery during his childhood most consistently point toward, and it is the fact that his subsequent statements about her, the warmth with which he has referred to her in contexts where his childhood is being discussed, most directly confirm. The meeting produced, over the years of the nursery, a child who was not broken by the institutional environment that surrounded him, who retained the quality of character that the environment was not designed to accommodate, and who developed, within the protected space of the nursery, the specific emotional resources that would eventually allow him to function in the public role, despite the formation's inadequacy. The protected space was Mabel's creation. She did not create it through any formal decision or explicit strategy. She created it through the daily quality of her presence, through the consistency, the attentiveness, the refusal to treat Charles's character as a problem requiring solution rather than a person requiring response. The space was as large as the nursery and as intimate as the specific interactions it contained, and within it, Charles had the experience of being known that the larger world around him was not providing. Philip's relationship with Mabel Anderson was not antagonistic. The accounts of the household during this period do not describe a Philip who was directly hostile to the nursery's atmosphere or who engaged in explicit contest with the approach Mabel brought to the children's care. What they describe is something more characteristically British and more characteristically Palace, a divergence of approach that was acknowledged through the ordinary operations of a household in which the staff managed the nursery and the parents engaged with the children in the contexts that the parents' schedule permitted, without either party formally addressing the divergence that the separation produced. Philip saw the children in the contexts that his schedule and the household structure made available. The mornings when he was present, the weekends when the family gathered in the ways that families gather, when the gathering is the structure within which togetherness happens, rather than the spontaneous expression of it, the outdoor activities that he organized and presided over, with the physical energy he brought to everything. In these contexts, his approach to the children was visible and was applied. In the nursery, between these contexts, Mabel's approach was visible and was applied. The children experienced both. Charles experienced both most acutely, because the divergence between the two approaches was most consequential for the child whose character made the divergence most apparent. He was simultaneously a child who received from one dimension of his daily world the message that his sensitivity was inadequate to the life he was going to live, and from another dimension, the message that his sensitivity was a legitimate quality that the person who knew him best had decided was worth protecting. The simultaneous reception of contradictory messages is a difficult experience for any child, and it produces, over time, the specific psychological complexity that the people who have written about Charles's formation have identified as a recurring theme in the accounts of his childhood and adolescence. The complexity is real. What the accounts have not always attended to is the dimension of the formation that counteracted the complexity's most damaging potential effects. The nursery, Mabel, the daily experience of being seen and responded to with an accuracy and a warmth that the rest of the institutional environment did not provide. The counteraction was not sufficient to resolve the complexity. No nursery, however well managed, is sufficient to resolve the complexities produced by a royal formation in the mid-20th century. But it was sufficient to ensure that the complexity did not produce the full damage that the formation's inadequacies, unmitigated, might have produced. That Charles retained, through the years of the nursery and through the subsequent years when the nursery was behind him, but Mabel remained a presence in his life, the access to his own character that the formation was designed to foreclose. Andrew and Edward experienced Philip's approach to formation differently, partly because their characters were differently equipped to receive it, and partly because the years of the 1960s had produced, in Philip's engagement with the family, a slight modulation of the approach that the passage of time and the experience of two older children had introduced. Andrew's robustness made him more naturally compatible with the physical confidence that Philip's formation valued, and the compatibility produced a relationship between father and son that was warmer in its visible texture than the relationship between Philip and Charles. Mabel managed Andrew's formation within this context, providing, as she always provided, the specific attention that the specific child required, rather than the application of a uniform approach to a category of child. Andrew's needs were different from Charles's needs, and her management of them was correspondingly different. More boundaried in the dimension of physical exuberance that Andrew's character made a daily management challenge, more focused on the direction of energy rather than the protection of sensitivity. Edward was the youngest and arrived into a household that was already, by 1964, beginning to transition away from the nursery-centered world of the early 1950s. Charles was at school. Anne was approaching the end of her nursery years. Andrew was 4. The household that Mabel managed for Edward was the household of a family that had already been substantially shaped by the years of formation that had preceded him, and his experience of the nursery was the experience of a child arriving at the end of a long institutional process rather than at its beginning. She brought the same attention to Edward that she had brought to the 3 children before him, calibrated to his specific character as she had calibrated it to each of the others. The calibration was never automatic, never the application of a fixed approach to a new subject. It was always the fresh observation of a specific person and the response to what the observation produced, and the freshness of it, the refusal to treat any child as simply the latest iteration of the previous ones, was what made the quality of her care consistent across 17 years and 4 fundamentally different children. Philip never acknowledged this quality directly in any public statement that has reached the record. He was not a man who acknowledged the contributions of household staff in public terms that would have made the acknowledgement available to the historical record. He operated within the assumptions of his class and his generation about the proper relationship between employers and employees in a royal household, assumptions that did not include the public acknowledgement of the staff's contribution to the children's formation as something worth naming specifically. Mabel did not require the acknowledgement. She required, and received, the continued ability to do the work that she understood to be worth doing, in the way that she understood it needed to be done, with the 4 children whose formation she had been trusted to manage. The trust was the acknowledgement. It was the only form of acknowledgement the institution offered. For Mabel Anderson, it was sufficient. By the time Charles married Diana Spencer in July 1981, Mabel Anderson had been in the royal household for 33 years. She had watched Charles grow from the infant whose early weeks she had shared in the nursery with Helen Lightbody, into the 32-year-old man standing in St. Paul's Cathedral, in the uniform of a naval commander, marrying a woman 20 years younger than Mabel had been when she first arrived at the palace. In the ceremony that the world received as a fairy tale, and that the people who knew Charles most clearly received with the more complicated mixture of hope and anxiety that genuine knowledge of a person produces when the person is making a decision of that magnitude. She knew him. The knowing was 50 years deep by the time the marriage occurred, rooted in the specific daily knowledge that the nursery years had produced and sustained by the continued connection that the years since the nursery had maintained. She had watched him across the formation that had produced him, the schools, the naval career, the long years of waiting for the public role that the role of heir requires the heir to wait for, and she had watched with the specific quality of attention that genuine knowledge of a person generates, which is an attention that registers the continuity of character beneath the surface changes that years and experience produce. What she understood about Charles, through all of it, was the specific quality of his need for connection, the depth of his requirement for the kind of engaged, attentive, emotionally present relationship that his formation had not consistently provided, and that the nursery had provided in the specific form available within its particular context. He needed, in a partner, the experience of being genuinely known, the same experience that Mabel had provided in the nursery, translated into the register of adult intimate relationship rather than the register of professional childcare. Whether Diana Spencer was the person who could provide that experience was the question that the marriage's subsequent history answered, and the answer was not the one the fairy tale required. Diana was 20 years old when she married Charles. She was a person whose own formation, the disrupted childhood, the parents' difficult divorce, the specific emotional landscape of someone who had grown up inside a family's dissolution, had produced needs that were no less real and no less deep than Charles's, and that were not more compatible with his than his were with hers, despite the public presentation of the match as the natural conclusion of a royal romance that the world had been waiting for. Mabel observed the marriage from the position that her decades in the household had established, present enough to see clearly, positioned appropriately enough to hold what she saw with the discretion that professional knowledge in a royal household requires. She was not a marriage counselor, she was not a family therapist, she was a nursery nurse, whose professional relationship to the family had been conducted through the children, and the children's marriages were not within her professional remit. They were within her human concern, and the distinction between professional remit and human concern is one that the accounts of Mabel Anderson's relationship to the family across the decades of the marriages suggest she navigated with the same precision she brought to everything else, maintaining the professional boundary without allowing the boundary to extinguish the genuine care for the people on the other side of it. Diana's relationship with Mabel was not the relationship that Charles had with her, because Diana came to the family as an adult rather than as a child, and had therefore not been formed within the nursery's particular world. But Diana had her own need for the kind of warmth and steadiness and uncomplicated human presence that Mabel provided to everyone in her orbit, with the same quality she had brought to the children in the nursery. And the accounts of people who observed Diana's relationship with Mabel in the early years of the marriage describe a connection that was genuine on both sides, Diana's genuine response to someone who offered her the specific quality of uncritical warmth that the palace's complex social world did not consistently provide, and Mabel's genuine engagement with a young woman whose vulnerability was visible to someone with her capacity for observation. The marriage's deterioration, the process that the years between the wedding and the separation made public in stages, through the Morton book and the Panorama interview, and the accumulation of press coverage that turned the private dissolution into a public spectacle, was a process that Mabel watched from the inside. The inside view she had was not the inside view of someone who was party to the specific decisions and conversations that the deterioration produced. It was the inside view of someone who had known Charles from infancy and who therefore had a context for understanding what the marriage's difficulties meant for him, that went beyond anything the press coverage or even the participants' own accounts could fully supply. She held that context without deploying it publicly. This is the consistent pattern of her entire relationship to the family's private history, the possession of a depth of knowledge and a quality of understanding that the public record would have benefited from, and that she chose, consistently and across every opportunity the decades provided, not to deploy. Anne's marriage to Mark Phillips in 1973 had preceded Charles's to Diana and had produced its own complications across the years of its duration. Anne was a person whose character Mabel had observed from infancy, the robustness, the directness, the physical confidence, the specific quality of determination that manifested in the horsemanship that became central to her identity and that carried her to Olympic competition in 1976. Anne's marriage reflected the character that Mabel had known from the nursery in ways that the marriage's subsequent history confirmed, a character that required from a partner an equivalence of strength and directness that Mark Phillips did not consistently provide, and that the marriage's eventual dissolution in 1992 reflected. Mabel watched this too. She watched it from the position of someone who had known the woman inside the marriage since the woman was an infant, and whose knowledge gave her understanding that the marriage's external observers did not have access to. The understanding was held with the same discretion as everything else, privately, carefully, without the deployment that would have cheapened it or damaged the people it concerned. Andrew's marriage to Sarah Ferguson in 1986 was the third of the royal marriages that Mabel observed from her position of long familiarity with the family. Andrew had been the most socially confident of the 4 children in the nursery, the most naturally at ease with the public dimensions of the royal role, the most directly shaped by Philip's values of physical confidence and outward competence. His marriage reflected this character in its early years. Sarah Ferguson was a person of considerable energy and social robustness, whose character seemed, in the marriage's beginning, compatible with Andrew's, in the way that similarly energetic people's characters can seem compatible before the sustained proximity of marriage reveals the differences that similarity obscures. The marriage's dissolution in 1992, the same year as Anne's, produced in the family a simultaneous reckoning with 2 failed marriages that the palace's management of the year described as an annus horribilis. Mabel had watched both of the marriages develop from the beginning, had known both of the royal parties to the marriages from infancy, and had the specific knowledge of both that her decades in the household had produced. Edward's marriage to Sophie Rhys-Jones in 1999 was the last of the 4 children's marriages, and it came after Mabel had been in the household for more than 50 years, after a span of time long enough that the woman who had managed the nursery, in which Edward had spent his earliest years, had become a figure whose presence in the family's life was itself a kind of institution, a continuity that spanned the marriages and the children and the decades in a way that almost nothing else about the royal family's private world matched. The marriages, taken together, produced a pattern that Mabel observed from a position no other person in the family's orbit occupied, the position of someone who had known all 4 of the married parties from infancy and who therefore had a context for understanding the marriages that went deeper than any journalist or biographer or family friend could access. She had the nursery knowledge, the knowledge of who each child had been before the world got to them, before the schools and the public roles and the institutional formation had overlaid the original character with the layers that adult life always produces. The nursery knowledge is the rarest and most complete knowledge available of any person. It is the knowledge of who they were before they learned to be anything other than who they were, the character beneath the formation, the self beneath the performance, the person that the years of subsequent experience built upon rather than replaced. Mabel held this knowledge for all 4 children across the entire span of their adult lives, including the lives of their marriages. She held it quietly, with the same discretion she had maintained since 1948, while the marriages played out in the public record, with the visibility that the family's position made unavoidable. She watched the fairy tale and the dissolution, and the public agony, and the annus horribilis, from inside the family's private world, knowing things about the people involved that the public record could not accommodate, and choosing, with the consistency that had defined her entire professional life, not to make that knowledge available to the record. The choosing was not calculation, it was character, the expression of a fundamental value about the relationship between what you know about people and what you are entitled to do with that knowledge, a value that Mabel had held and applied across 50 years of accumulating the most intimate available knowledge of the most scrutinized family in the world. She knew. She chose silence. The choosing was as significant as anything she did with the children in the nursery. The nursery at Buckingham Palace was not a single room. It was a suite of rooms on the upper floors of the palace, removed from the formal state apartments that the public associated with the building and from the working offices where the business of the monarchy was conducted. It had its own rhythm, its own daily schedule, its own internal hierarchy of staff, and its own relationship to the larger institution that surrounded it, a relationship of managed separation, in which the nursery's operations were understood to be the nursery's business, and the palace's formal operations were understood to be something the nursery existed alongside rather than inside. The separation was spatial, and it was also institutional. The people who ran the palace, the private secretaries, the ladies-in-waiting, the equerries, the press officers, the financial advisors, the ceremonial staff, were people whose professional world did not routinely intersect with the nursery's world. They knew the nursery existed. They knew children were being raised in it. The specific daily operations of the raising were not part of their professional concern, and the people whose professional concern it was, Mabel Anderson, and the small staff who worked alongside her, were people whose position in the palace's formal hierarchy was sufficiently distinct from the operational hierarchy that the 2 worlds ran in parallel without significant overlap. This separation gave the nursery a quality that almost nowhere else in the palace possessed, the quality of being genuinely outside the institutional gaze. The palace's formal operations were subject to the monitoring that any large institution applies to its significant functions. The nursery was not a significant function in the institutional sense. It was a domestic function, managed by domestic staff, producing outcomes, for royal children, that the institution cared about deeply, without caring particularly about the specific processes through which the outcomes were produced. The indifference to process was the nursery's most significant institutional characteristic, and it was the characteristic that gave Mabel Anderson her particular freedom. She was managing the formation of the most significant children in Britain without the institutional oversight that the significance of the task would seem to warrant, because the institution that should have been overseeing the task had no framework for understanding the task's significance in terms that would have produced oversight. This is the specific institutional blindness that royal households of the mid-20th century exhibited toward the nursery, a blindness produced by the assumption that childcare was a domestic matter rather than a political one, that the people who managed it were domestic staff rather than professionals whose work shaped the institution's future, and that the outcomes of the nursery could be managed separately from the processes of the nursery, without the separation producing consequences that the institution would eventually have to absorb. The consequences were absorbed, across the decades that followed the nursery years, in the specific form that the outcomes of unexamined formation always take, in the characters of the 4 children who had been formed within the nursery's separation from institutional oversight, characters that the institution then engaged with across the decades of the children's adult royal lives, without always understanding where the characters had come from or what the nursery's management of them had produced. Mabel understood. She had produced the outcomes, not unilaterally, not without the contribution of the parents and the schools and the larger world that surrounded the nursery, but in the specific dimension of the daily texture of the children's earliest years, the dimension that developmental psychology has consistently identified as the most consequential for the character formation that subsequent experience builds upon. She had managed that dimension with a clarity of purpose and a quality of attention that the institutional indifference to the process had left entirely free to express itself according to her own judgment. Her judgment was, across the 17 years of the nursery, consistently good. The evidence of the judgment's quality is in the characters of the 4 children it shaped, in Charles's retention of the emotional sensitivity that the institutional formation had tried to correct, in Anne's development of the directed determination that Mabel's specific management of her particular character had supported, in Andrew's social confidence, in Edward's relative stability in the context of a family whose adult years produced a degree of public difficulty that the nursery years had not anticipated. The nursery was also a space of intimacy, of a kind that the palace's formal world could not produce and did not understand. Intimacy in a royal household is a managed resource. It is allocated according to the institutional logic that determines which relationships are appropriate and which are not, which proximities are sanctioned and which require management, and what the proper distance between the people inside the institution should be given the hierarchies that the institution maintains. The nursery's separation from this managed world meant that the intimacy it produced was not managed in the same way. Mabel knew things about the children that nobody outside the nursery knew. She knew the specific texture of each child's morning, the particular quality of their waking, the mood that the first hour of the day produced in each of them, the small signals that indicated what the day was going to require in terms of management, and what it was going to produce in terms of the child's experience of themselves. She knew the nighttime fears, Charles's in particular, which the accounts of the nursery during his early years suggest were real and specific, rather than the general childhood anxiety that the palace's formal presentation of the children managed away from public knowledge. She knew the food preferences and the play preferences and the specific qualities of each child's relationship to the physical world around them. She knew, in the most direct sense of knowing, that daily intimate contact produces who each of the 4 children actually was. The knowing was not the product of observation alone, but of relationship, of the sustained, daily, mutual engagement that produces in both parties a knowledge of the other that observation from a distance cannot replicate. The children knew things about Mabel too, knew her moods, her preferences, the specific way she managed the nursery's daily operations, the particular quality of her presence in the room, the difference between the Mabel of the easy days and the Mabel of the days when the management required more. This mutual knowing was the foundation of the attachment that has been described by the people who have observed or reported on it across the decades since the nursery years, as one of the most significant and most durable relationships in the lives of each of the 4 children, particularly Charles, whose adult statements about Mabel have consistently conveyed a depth of feeling that the royal family's characteristic reticence about private matters makes more rather than less significant. The palace's indifference to the nursery's process created a second consequence that the institution has never examined: the absence of any mechanism for understanding what the nursery provided to the children, or for ensuring that the provision continued when the nursery's primary provider changed. When Helen Lightbody left in 1956, the transition to Mabel Anderson as the nursery's primary figure was managed with the institutional efficiency of a personnel change, rather than with any assessment of what the change meant for the children who were living inside the nursery's world. The assessment would have required the institution to acknowledge that the nursery's process mattered, that the specific person managing it was not interchangeable with any other competent nursery nurse, that the specific relationship between the manager and the children was itself a developmental resource whose disruption had developmental consequences. The institution did not make this acknowledgement. It made the personnel change and returned its attention to the formal operations that constituted its primary concern. The fact that the change from Lightbody to Mabel Anderson produced, for the children, an outcome that was positive rather than damaging, that Mabel's particular quality of attention provided something that sustained and even enhanced what the nursery had been providing, was not a result of institutional planning, but of institutional luck. The luck was that the person who happened to be available to fill the senior nursery role was a person of exceptional quality, whose specific gifts were precisely what the children in the nursery at that moment needed. The institution did not seek those gifts. It did not identify them as relevant. It hired a nursery nurse and got, through the accident of Mabel Anderson's specific character, something considerably more significant than the role description suggested. The room the palace forgot to monitor was the room that shaped the institution's future. The children formed in that room became the adults who were the monarchy's next generation, who carried the institution into the second half of the 20th century, who made the decisions and the marriages and the public choices that determined what the monarchy looked like in the decades of the reign that followed the nursery years. Their characters had been shaped in the nursery by the daily management of a woman whose work the institution understood as domestic rather than formative. The domestic and the formative are not different things in the experience of a child. They are the same thing, described from different perspectives. From the institution's perspective, which sees the domestic as a support function, and from the child's perspective, which experiences the domestic as the totality of the world that is shaping them. Mabel understood this from the position of the child's perspective, which is the perspective that the children's daily reality had given her access to, and she managed the domestic with the awareness that the domestic was the formative, that what she was doing in the nursery every day was not simply keeping children fed and bathed and occupied, but making the specific human beings that the institution's future would depend on. The palace forgot to monitor this. The forgetting was institutional rather than personal. No individual made a decision to leave the nursery unmonitored. The institutional structure simply had no mechanism for understanding the nursery as something that warranted monitoring, and therefore produced no monitoring, and therefore left Mabel Anderson to manage the formation of 4 royal children, according to her own judgment, for 17 years. Her judgment was better than the institution's would have been. The institution's would have been calibrated to its own requirements. Hers was calibrated to the children's. The difference was everything. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. When Diana arrived at the palace as Princess of Wales in 1981, the nursery that had shaped her husband's childhood was a space whose significance she understood intuitively rather than analytically. She had not been raised in a royal household. She had not experienced the specific formation that the palace's world produced in the children born inside it. But she had been a nursery school teacher before the engagement had made teaching impossible, and the experience of working with young children had given her a practical relationship to the question of what children need, that the palace's formal assumptions about child formation had not always prioritized. She wanted to be present for her children in ways that the palace's operational logic did not naturally accommodate, and that her observation of Charles's relationship to his own formation had made her determined to provide. The determination was genuine and was expressed in specific decisions about breastfeeding, about the children's public appearances, about the environments that William and Harry were introduced to in their early years, that represented a conscious departure from the approach that the previous generation of royal parents had followed. Mabel was not the primary nanny to William and Harry, in the sense that she had been primary to the 4 children she had raised from the 1950s and 1960s. By the time William was born in 1982, she had been in the royal household for 34 years and occupied a position within it that was no longer defined primarily by the active management of a nursery. She was present, connected to the household in the sustained way that decades of service produce, when the institution values the continuity that long service provides, and her connection to Charles meant that her presence in the world of his children was natural rather than formally arranged. She knew Diana. The knowing was not the same depth of knowing that she had of Charles. It lacked the nursery foundation, the years of daily intimate contact that had given her knowledge of Charles a quality that no subsequent relationship could replicate. But it was genuine knowing, built on observation and on the specific quality of attention that Mabel brought to everyone in the family's orbit, and the observation had produced in her an understanding of Diana that the palace's formal assessment of the new princess had not consistently matched. What Mabel understood about Diana was what she understood about all the children she had cared for and all the adults those children had become. The specific character beneath the public presentation, the actual person, rather than the institutional role. Diana in public was the fairy tale, the beautiful, warm, compassionate princess whose connection to ordinary people what the press had identified and amplified into a phenomenon that reshaped the public's relationship to the monarchy. Diana in private was a young woman whose own formation had left her with needs that the palace's world was not equipped to meet, and whose genuine qualities, the warmth, the perceptiveness, the capacity for connection, existed alongside vulnerabilities that the institutional environment she had entered was not designed to support. Mabel saw both. She saw them with the specific clarity that comes from long familiarity with the family Diana had married into, the ability to place Diana's experience of the palace against the context of what she knew about the palace's internal world, its dynamics, its specific ways of failing the people it contained. The context gave her assessment of Diana's difficulties a precision that outside observers, however perceptive, could not match. William's birth in June 1982 produced in Diana a determination that has been documented across the accounts of the period by people who observed it. A determination to be the kind of mother that the palace's operational logic did not straightforwardly permit. To provide for her son a quality of daily maternal presence that her own childhood's disruptions had denied her, and that Charles's childhood had also, in its different way. The determination was genuine, and it produced real differences in how William's early years were managed, relative to how Charles's early years had been managed. But the determination operated inside the same institutional constraints that had shaped Charles's formation: the public schedule, the official engagements, the demands of a royal role that were not reduced by the presence of a new baby, and that produced the same structural absences that the previous generation of royal parents had navigated. Diana navigated them with the specific anguish of someone for whom the gap between her intentions and the institutional reality was experienced as personal failure rather than structural constraint. Mabel watched this with the specific concern of someone who had spent 30 years understanding what royal parents' structural constraints produced in royal children. She had managed the consequences of those constraints across the nursery years of Charles and his siblings. She could see, in the specific quality of Diana's determination to avoid producing the same consequences, both the genuine value of the determination and the specific difficulty of the institutional context within which the determination was being maintained. The nannies who managed William and Harry's daily care in the 1980s were not Mabel. They were younger women, differently trained, operating in a decade that had produced shifts in the orthodoxies of childcare that the 1950s professional culture had not anticipated. Barbara Barnes, who was the primary nanny to William and Harry in their early years, operated with an approach that reflected both the period's changed assumptions and Diana's specific preferences about the children's management, preferences that were more directly expressed than the preferences of the previous generation of royal parents had been, and that created a different dynamic between the parents and the nursery staff than the dynamic that had characterized the nursery of Charles's childhood. The different dynamic was itself a product of what Charles's childhood had produced. He had grown up in a household where the nursery's operations were managed at sufficient distance from the parents' direct involvement that the nanny's approach shaped the nursery's atmosphere without significant parental intervention. He had formed within that distance a set of experiences that the adult Charles carried into his own parenthood, including the specific understanding of what daily parental presence meant, derived from its relative absence in his own formation, and the specific understanding of what a nanny's sustained presence meant, derived from Mabel's central role in his own formation. The combination of his experience and Diana's determination produced a household in which the question of how William and Harry were raised was more actively contested between the parents and the institutional logic than it had been in the previous generation, and in which Mabel's presence, as the living embodiment of the nursery tradition that Charles had been formed within, was a reference point rather than a current practitioner. She represented continuity, in a household that was generating discontinuity. Her presence in Charles's life during the 1980s, the connection she maintained with him across the years of his marriage's deterioration, was the presence of someone who had known him before the deterioration's conditions had been created, who held in her knowledge of him a version of who he was that the marriage's difficulties were making difficult to access. Harry was born in 1984, 2 years after William, and his arrival completed the family that the marriage was simultaneously creating and beginning to damage. Diana's management of both children in their early years reflected the determination that William's birth had produced, and the specific quality of that management, the physical warmth, the deliberate exposure to ordinary life, the resistance to the institutional protocols that had governed the previous generation's childhood, was visible enough to generate both public admiration and institutional discomfort. The institutional discomfort was familiar to Mabel. She had been the cause of it, in a quiet way, across the 17 years of her own nursery management. The nursery nurse, who had managed the royal children according to her own judgment of their needs, rather than according to the institution's assumptions about what royal children required. The discomfort her approach had generated had been managed by the same institutional indifference that had characterized the palace's general relationship to the nursery. It had simply not been noticed, because the institutional gaze had not been directed at the nursery with sufficient attention to notice what was happening within it. Diana's approach was noticed, because Diana was noticed in a way that Mabel had never been. Every decision Diana made about her children's formation was available to the press coverage that surrounded her, and the press coverage gave the institutional discomfort a public dimension that Mabel's quiet management of the previous generation had never produced. The parallel between what Mabel had done in the 1950s and 1960s and what Diana was attempting in the 1980s was not lost on the people close to Charles who observed both. They were doing the same thing from different positions, resisting the institutional logic of royal child formation in favor of the specific needs of specific children, providing or attempting to provide what the institution was not designed to supply, insisting on the primacy of the child's actual character over the institution's assumed requirements. Mabel had succeeded in this resistance quietly, protected by the institutional indifference that had left the nursery unmonitored. Diana was attempting it publicly, in the full glare of the coverage that made everything she did a statement about the monarchy and its relationship to modernity. The difference in their situations was the difference between the invisibility that protected Mabel's freedom and the visibility that constrained Diana's. What Mabel saw, watching the marriage and the children and the institutional dynamics of the 1980s from her position of long familiarity with the family, was the specific shape of what was coming, not through any particular insight that the others around her lacked, but through the context that her decades in the household provided. She had seen what the palace did to people who did not fit its requirements. She had managed the children who were formed inside that process. She understood, from the inside, the institutional logic that Diana was resisting and the costs that the resistance would produce. She saw what was coming. She could not prevent it. She maintained her connection to Charles through the years of the marriage's deterioration and the public dissolution that followed, providing what she had always provided, the sustained presence of someone who knew him completely and whose knowledge was not conditional on anything the marriage's condition produced. That provision, across the hardest years of his adult life, was the nursery's last and most significant gift to the child it had formed. Most professional relationships have natural endpoints. The job finishes, the contract concludes, the children grow up, and the nanny moves to another family, carrying the knowledge of one household into the next, with the professional discretion that the transition requires. The knowledge accumulates across a career, distributed across multiple families, diluted by the succession of children and households that professional childcare inevitably produces when it is conducted across a working lifetime. Mabel Anderson's professional relationship with the royal family did not follow this pattern. She arrived in 1948 and she stayed, through the nursery years and beyond them, through the children's schooling and their marriages, and the arrivals of the grandchildren, who would eventually carry the institution into the 21st century. She stayed not because the institution required her to stay, There was no formal arrangement that made her departure impossible or her continued presence compulsory, but because the family had become, across the decades of her service, the world she inhabited in the most complete sense available to someone who has placed their professional life entirely inside a single sustained relationship. The staying produced a knowledge of the family that has no parallel in any other individual's relationship to the royal household. Biographers come and go, working from documents and interviews and the secondary accounts of people who were present for specific events. Journalists observe from outside, gaining access to selected dimensions of the family's world through the managed channels that the palace's communications operation maintains. Even the people closest to the family, the private secretaries, the ladies-in-waiting, the senior household staff, occupy positions whose specific character limits the knowledge they accumulate to the professional dimensions of the relationship that their roles produce. Mabel's knowledge was different in kind from all of these. It was the knowledge of someone who had been inside the family's private world from before the current Queen's coronation, who had been present for the childhood years of the Queen's children, with a daily intimacy that no subsequent relationship could replicate, and that no professional category fully describes. She was not family. She was not staff in the way that the footmen and the housemaids were staff. She was something that the palace's formal vocabulary had no adequate term for, a person who had been inside the family's world long enough and intimately enough that the relationship had developed a character of its own that exceeded any of the categories available to describe it. The grandchildren experienced her as a presence whose significance they understood before they were old enough to understand why it was significant. Charles's sons, William, born in 1982, and Harry, born in 1984, knew Mabel as the person who was always there in the specific way that certain people who are connected to a family across multiple generations are always there, not managing their daily lives, not performing the nursery function that she had performed for their father and his siblings, but present in the family's orbit with the particular quality of permanence that very long relationships develop. The permanence was not simply temporal. It was the permanence of a relationship whose depth made its continuation feel like a condition of the family's world, rather than a choice that either party was making independently. She was part of the fabric of the household in a way that new arrivals, new staff, new relationships, the marriages that brought new people into the family, did not initially displace, because the fabric had been woven over too many years to be easily altered by any single addition. What 50 years inside one family's private history produces is a form of knowledge that is simultaneously the most valuable available and the most impossible to fully deploy. The knowledge is too specific, too intimate, too deeply embedded in the particular texture of a particular family's private world to be translatable into the general terms that public discourse requires. It exists in the accumulated detail of daily observation rather than in the recoverable form of documented events, and its depth is inseparable from its specificity, the knowing of particular people in particular moments rather than the knowing of general patterns across multiple subjects. Mabel held this knowledge for 50 years without deploying it in any public form. The holding was not passive storage, it was active, ongoing, daily engagement with the family whose history she held, continuing to observe and to understand, and to provide what her presence could provide in the years beyond the nursery's active operation. The continued observation extended what she knew across the decades that followed the nursery years, adding to the nursery knowledge the adult knowledge of who the children had become and what their adult lives had produced. She watched Charles through the Camilla years. The sustained relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles that had preceded the marriage to Diana had continued through it and would eventually produce the second marriage that the public's initial reception of it made complicated in ways that the palace had to manage carefully. She had known Charles since infancy. She understood the specific quality of what the Camilla relationship provided for him, the connection to someone who knew him as an adult in the way that Mabel had known him as a child, whose knowledge of him was sustained and specific and not conditional on the public role's requirements. The parallel between what Mabel had provided in the nursery and what Camilla provided in the adult relationship is not an analogy that requires elaboration to be understood. It is simply the observation that Charles, across his entire life, had found in the specific sustained relationships that were built on genuine knowledge of him, a thing that the institutional world around him had consistently failed to provide. Mabel had been the first and most foundational of those relationships. The understanding of that position, held by someone who had occupied it for 50 years, gave her a perspective on the adult relationships that formed around Charles that was unlike any other perspective available. She did not share that perspective publicly. The discipline of her discretion was absolute and was maintained absolutely across the entire span of her relationship with the family. Through the nursery years, through the marriages, through the public crises of the 1990s that made the royal family the subject of the most sustained and most damaging press coverage in the institution's modern history. The 1990s were the decade that tested every relationship in the royal family and that produced, in the space of 4 years, the Squidgy tapes, the Camilla tapes, the Morton book, the Panorama interview, the separations, the divorces, and the annus horribilis that the Queen named in the speech that acknowledged what the year had been. Mabel was inside the family during all of it, not in the specific rooms where the decisions were made or the conversations that produced the public crises were conducted, but in the sustained presence that 50 years of service had made an unremarked fixture of the family's world. Her presence during the 1990s was the presence of continuity in a decade that was producing discontinuity on a scale the institution had not experienced in the previous century. Everything that had seemed fixed about the royal family's public presentation was being unfixed, in the specific way that press coverage of private information unfixes public presentations that have been carefully maintained, by revealing the gap between the presentation and the reality, and by making that gap the story. The gap had always existed. Mabel had been inside the gap for 50 years, managing the children who inhabited it, with the daily attention that the gap's existence required. She had managed the children who had grown into the adults whose marriages were now producing the crises, and she held the knowledge of who those adults had been in the nursery, the specific human beings beneath the royal personas, the characters that had been formed before the personas were required. Diana's death in August 1997 arrived inside this context. Mabel had known Diana across the 16 years of her marriage to Charles, had observed her with the specific quality of observation that the palace context produced in someone with Mabel's decades of experience of the family. She had understood Diana's vulnerability and her genuine quality and the specific ways in which the palace's world had failed to meet either. She had watched the marriage's deterioration from the inside, with the nursery knowledge of Charles that gave her an understanding of his experience of the deterioration that no outside observer could replicate. Diana's death produced in the family the specific quality of grief that sudden violent loss produces, immediate, total, without the gradual preparation that anticipated death provides. It produced it in the context of the public grief that surrounded and in some ways overwhelmed the family's private grief, making the processing of personal loss a task that had to be performed inside the visibility that the monarchy's position made unavoidable. Mabel held her place in the family's world through the death and its aftermath, with the same steadiness she had held it through everything else across 50 years. She was not a public figure in the crisis. She was not the person whose statement was sought or whose position on the events was reported. She was the person who had been there since before the current Queen's coronation and who was still there, holding the continuity that 50 years of presence provides when everything around it is in motion. The continuity was her final and most significant contribution to the institution she had served. Not the nursery years, not the specific formation of the 4 royal children, not even the discretion that had kept the intimate knowledge of a family's private world private across 5 decades. The final contribution was simply the being there, the sustained, unbroken, unremarked presence of someone whose connection to the family went back further than almost any other living relationship they possessed, and whose continued presence in their world was a form of stability that the 1990s turbulence could not disrupt. She had been there for everything. She had said nothing. She remained. In a decade that had produced more disclosure about the royal family than any previous decade of the institution's modern history, the person who knew the most had produced none of it. That was Mabel Anderson, at 50 years, present, knowing, silent, and irreplaceable, in the specific way that people become irreplaceable when they have been inside a world longer than anyone else can remember not having them there. The British royal household has, across the centuries of its operation, developed a specific relationship to the people who serve it, a relationship whose terms are understood by both parties without being formally articulated, whose obligations run more clearly in one direction than the other, and whose settlement, when settlement eventually comes, consistently favors the institution over the individual in proportions that the individuals involved have historically accepted without the public contest that the proportions would seem to warrant. The terms are not secret. They are simply unexamined, maintained by the institutional assumption that service to the Crown carries its own reward in the form of proximity to significance, and that the proximity constitutes adequate compensation for the specific costs that the service imposes on the people who provide it. The assumption is self-serving and has been self-serving for as long as the institution has maintained it, and its self-serving character has not prevented its continued maintenance, because the people in the best position to contest it are the people whose service has given them the most to lose from contesting it. Mabel Anderson served the royal family for 50 years. What the institution gave her in return for those 50 years has never been fully established in the public record, because the terms of royal household employment are not public documents, and the palace has no tradition of disclosing the financial and material arrangements it makes with long-serving staff. What is known, from the accounts of people who were close to her in the later years of her service, is that the arrangements were comfortable, in the modest sense of the word, sufficient for a woman living alone in the grace-and-favour accommodation that the palace provided, without the material abundance that 50 years of service to the wealthiest family in Britain might have been expected to produce. The grace-and-favour apartment was a real provision. The palace's tradition of providing housing to long-serving staff, whose working life had been conducted inside the institution's physical world, was a genuine acknowledgement of the practical problem that long royal service produces. The problem of a person who has spent their entire working life in residences owned by the institution, and who therefore has no independent housing at the end of a career that the institution's ownership of its residences has prevented them from using to accumulate. The provision was also, like all grace-and-favour arrangements, a provision that carried within its generosity the reminder of its conditional nature. The apartment was available for as long as the palace chose to make it available. It was not owned. It was not a pension in the form of a capital asset that would support the occupant, regardless of what the institution subsequently decided. It was a continued relationship with the institution, expressed in the language of accommodation rather than the language of employment, and it required for its continuation the continued goodwill of the people who controlled it. The financial pension that supplemented the accommodation has not been reported in any specific form that allows assessment. The general character of royal household pensions for domestic staff of Mabel's generation and seniority has been described, in the accounts of people familiar with the household's employment practices, as modest by the standards that 50 years of service to a private institution of equivalent resources would typically have produced. The modesty was not unusual. It was the standard outcome of an employment relationship whose terms had been set within a tradition that valued loyalty and discretion above material compensation, and that had never been required to revise that valuation by any external pressure. What the institution owed Mabel Anderson, beyond the financial and material provisions whose modesty the record suggests were inadequate to the scale of what she had provided, was something that no financial provision could have discharged: the acknowledgement that what she had done mattered, in the specific way that things matter when their mattering has shaped the world in ways that go beyond the immediate dimensions of the work. She had raised 4 royal children. The raising had been conducted at the most formative level of their development, across the years, when the characters that would subsequently be applied to the demands of royal life were being formed, and it had been conducted with a quality of attention and care that the outcomes, the specific adults that the 4 children became, reflect without any individual being in a position to confirm what the reflection represents. The difficulty of confirming what the reflection represents is the specific difficulty of assessing the contribution of people who do formative work. The contribution does not produce a single identifiable outcome that can be pointed to as evidence. It produces character, the accumulated quality of a person's way of engaging with the world, which is formed across thousands of small interactions rather than in any single significant event, and which cannot be traced back to any specific cause without the simplification that attribution always produces. Nobody can say with precision that Charles's retention of his emotional sensitivity across the decades of a formation that consistently tried to correct it was the direct result of Mabel Anderson's management of that sensitivity in the nursery. What can be said is that the nursery was the primary environment in which Charles's emotional sensitivity was encountered and responded to in the years before the formation's corrective pressure was applied, and that the quality of the response shaped what the sensitivity became rather than what the pressure tried to make it, and that the response was Mabel's. The palace acknowledged her service in the way that the palace acknowledges the service of people whose contribution it values, without having a framework for valuing it at the level the contribution warrants. She was given a Royal Victorian Medal, which is the award that the sovereign bestows for personal service to the royal family, and which occupies a specific position in the honours system that indicates genuine royal appreciation without placing the recipient in the categories of recognition that the honours system reserves for contributions to public life rather than private service. The medal was genuine. It was also the institutional translation of 50 years of intimate service into the decorative language that the honours system provides for exactly this category of contribution. The translation that makes the acknowledgement visible without requiring the institution to examine what the acknowledgement is acknowledging, or to articulate, in any form that would remain in the public record, the specific nature and scale of the debt it is discharging through the decoration. Charles's acknowledgement of what Mabel meant to him has been expressed in the contexts where his childhood and his formation have been discussed, in the warmth of his references to her, in the specific quality of the emotion that surfaces when her name is mentioned in his proximity, in the continued connection to her that he maintained across the decades of his adult life. The acknowledgement is genuine, and it is personal, and it is expressed in the register of personal feeling rather than the register of institutional recognition, which is the register that fits the relationship, but is also the register that leaves it outside the formal record. The formal record contains Mabel Anderson as a footnote, the Royal Victorian Medal, the decades of service, the name attached to the role attached to the children's names. The formal record does not contain what the relationship between Mabel and the children actually was, the specific quality of the daily knowing, the specific character of what she provided in the nursery, the specific dimension of the formation she managed, and what that management produced in the 4 specific people who were formed within it. The formal record is not designed to contain these things. It is designed to contain what can be formally documented and formally attributed and formally acknowledged within the institutional categories that the documentation systems were built to accommodate. The nursery's contribution to the institution's future is not formally documentable in those terms. It lives in the characters of the people it produced, which is where all formative contributions live, invisibly, indistinguishably, inseparably from the person who carries them, and without any mechanism for the separation that attribution would require. She was given a medal. She was given an apartment. She was given the personal gratitude of the children she had raised, expressed in the private ways that people express gratitude to the people who mattered most to them in the years before they had the language to articulate what the mattering meant. She was not given the public acknowledgement that the public contribution warranted. The public did not know, for most of the decades of her service and for most of the decades since, what Mabel Anderson had provided to the family whose children she had raised. The palace had no mechanism for making that public, and no particular interest in making it public, and the result was the result that institutional indifference to formative work always produces. The person who did the work remained invisible to the world that benefited from it. The world that benefited from it includes everyone who has been affected, in any way, by the character of the 4 royal children she raised. Which means, given the public roles those 4 children went on to occupy, and the specific ways in which their characters shaped the decisions they made in those roles, the world that benefited from Mabel Anderson's work is considerably larger than the nursery at Buckingham Palace. The institution never found a way to say this. The institution rarely does. The children knew. The knowing was the acknowledgement that mattered. Whether it was the acknowledgement she deserved is a different question, and the answer to it is no. She deserved the public accounting that the public contribution warranted, and the public accounting was never produced. The absence of it is the palace's debt. The debt is outstanding. The market for royal memoirs in the second half of the 20th century was not a small market. It was a sustained, well-funded, editorially competitive market whose appetite for authentic accounts of life inside the royal household grew in direct proportion to the public's appetite for the royal family as a subject, an appetite that the television age had converted from the general public interest of the newspaper era into something closer to a mass cultural preoccupation. Publishers pursued people with genuine inside knowledge of the family, with the specific enthusiasm of people who understood that authenticity was the scarcest resource in a market flooded with secondary accounts and speculative biographies. The people they most wanted were the people who had been closest to the family in the most intimate contexts, the staff whose daily proximity to the private lives of the royals gave them the specific kind of knowledge that no journalist working from the outside could replicate. Mabel Anderson was at the top of that list. She was, by any assessment of who possessed the deepest and most sustained inside knowledge of the royal family's private world, the most significant untapped source in the market. 50 years inside the family's most intimate domestic spaces, the daily knowledge of 4 royal children across the entirety of their nursery years, continued connection to the family across the decades of the children's adult lives, including the marriages and the crises and the public dissolution of the 1990s. She had been present for more of the family's private history than any journalist had ever accessed, and the account she could have given would have been, by every measure applicable to the genre, the definitive insider memoir of the 20th century royal family. She was approached. This is established in the accounts of people who were close to her during the decades when the market for royal memoirs was at its most active, the 1980s and 1990s, when the Wales marriage crisis had raised the temperature of public interest in the family's private life to a level that produced genuine financial offers for genuine inside accounts. The approaches were made by publishers and by journalists through the various channels that such approaches use when the target is someone whose professional context makes direct contact complicated. She declined. Every approach, across every decade in which the approaches were made, produced the same response, a decline so consistent and so complete that it eventually communicated to the people making the approaches that the declination was not a negotiating position, but a position, and that the position was not going to change regardless of what the offer contained. The financial dimension of the decision she made across those decades is not trivial and deserves more attention than it typically receives in the accounts of her life that have been produced. She was not a wealthy woman. Her income across 50 years of royal service had been the income of a household employee in a tradition that valued loyalty above material compensation, and the material compensation that the tradition produced had left her without the independent financial security that 50 years of service to a privately wealthy institution might have been expected to provide. The books she did not write would have sold. The accounts she did not give would have been published. The financial return on a memoir by the woman who had raised Charles and Anne and Andrew and Edward would have been substantial in the specific way that genuinely scarce and genuinely authentic resources command substantial returns when a market with deep pockets and genuine appetite identifies them. She would have been, had she chosen to sell what she knew, materially comfortable in a way that the palace's provision for her had not made her. She chose not to sell it. The choice was not made once, in a single moment of decision that produced a clean resolution. It was remade, across every approach and every decade, as a continuing commitment to a position that the offers consistently invited her to revise. The consistency of the commitment across 50 years of opportunities to revise it is the measure of how deeply the position was held and how genuinely it expressed something central to her character. What the position expressed was a specific understanding of the relationship between knowledge and obligation, an understanding that the knowledge she held about the family was not hers to deploy according to her own interests, because the knowledge had been produced by a relationship of trust, and the relationship of trust had terms that deployment for personal gain violated. The children had been in her care. The care had produced intimate knowledge of who they were. The intimate knowledge was a product of the care, not a commodity that the care had incidentally accumulated, and treating it as a commodity would have been a violation of the care's character that the character of the care made intolerable. This is a sophisticated ethical position, and it is easy to describe it in terms that make it sound straightforwardly noble without engaging with the specific difficulty of holding it across 50 years of genuine financial pressure and genuine public opportunity. The nobility of the position does not exist in the abstract. It exists in the specific daily renewal of a commitment that the market's appetite for what she knew consistently invited her to abandon. The daily renewal was the achievement. Not the position itself, which any thoughtful person might arrive at, but the maintenance of it across the specific conditions that made maintenance difficult. The financial pressure, the approaches, the knowledge that the money was available, and that the only thing preventing her from accessing it was a commitment to people who were, in the formal sense, her former employers, rather than her family. They were not her family, but the relationship that 50 years of intimate service had produced was a relationship that the formal vocabulary of employer and employee had never adequately described, and the commitment she maintained was the commitment of someone who had decided that the specific nature of the relationship made specific obligations, regardless of what the formal categories suggested. The press, in the years when it was most actively pursuing royal insiders for their accounts, developed a specific attitude toward Mabel Anderson's silence, an attitude that oscillated between frustration at the inaccessibility of someone who was understood to hold extraordinarily valuable material and a grudging respect for the completeness of a discretion that the market's resources had failed to penetrate. She was reported on occasionally in the contexts where the royal household's domestic arrangements were discussed, and the reporting consistently characterized her silence as remarkable without examining what the silence cost or what its maintenance required. The cost was real. The opportunity foregone was genuine. The financial security she did not have because she chose not to sell what she knew was a financial security whose absence was the direct consequence of a choice she had made repeatedly and with full awareness of what the choice was foregoing. The palace benefited from her silence in direct ways that the palace has never formally acknowledged. Her account of the children's formation would have complicated the official narrative of the royal family's private life in ways that would have required institutional responses, would have produced the kind of public discussion of what the nursery's management had actually involved, and what the parenting that surrounded it had actually looked like, that the palace's careful management of its public image was designed to prevent. The silence that prevented this was a gift to the institution of considerable institutional value, and the institution received it without producing any acknowledgement of its value that has reached the public record. She did not give the silence for the institution. She gave it for the children, for the specific people whose intimate lives the silence protected, rather than for the abstract institution whose image the protection served. The distinction mattered to her, or at least the distinction is consistent with everything else known about the character that her professional choices expressed across 50 years. The children, in their adult lives, knew what her silence had protected. They knew, each of them, that the person who had known them most completely in the years before they had the capacity to know themselves had chosen, consistently and at personal cost, not to make that knowledge available to the world that would have paid well for it. The knowing produced in each of them, most visibly in Charles, whose references to her carry the specific quality of feeling that acknowledgement of this particular kind of loyalty produces, a gratitude that was private and genuine, in the way that the most significant gratitudes always are. The gratitude could not discharge the debt. The silence had been worth more than the gratitude could repay in any form that the relationship between a former royal child and a former nanny, however genuine its warmth, could produce. The debt existed at a level that personal gratitude, however sincere, was not the adequate instrument for addressing. The adequate instrument would have been the public accounting, The formal acknowledgement that what Mabel Anderson had provided to the royal family across 50 years of service, including the 50 years of silence about what the service had produced, represented a contribution of a specific and irreplaceable character that the institution was unable to value adequately and should acknowledge being unable to value adequately. The public accounting was not produced. The institution does not produce public accountings of its own inadequacies. It manages them, adjusts around them, allows time and institutional continuity to absorb them without the specific acknowledgement that the inadequacy warrants. Mabel Anderson's 50 years of silence was absorbed in this way, noted, appreciated in the private register that the institution uses for appreciation it cannot formally acknowledge, and then managed into the category of things the institution has received, without being required to account for receiving. The market that she declined to enter eventually moved on to other subjects and other sources. The stories were told without her. The accounts of the royal family's private life across the decades of her service were assembled from secondary sources, from the people who had been present for less but had been willing to report on what they had seen, from the documents and the photographs and the carefully managed disclosures of people whose relationship to the family gave them less than Mabel had, and whose willingness to share what they had gave them more column inches than her silence produced. The accounts that resulted were less accurate for her absence. They were less complete. They were missing the specific depth and the specific quality of observation that 50 years of the closest available proximity to the family's private world would have supplied. And the missing is visible in the retrospective assessments of the period, in the questions that remain unanswered, in the characterizations of the royal children that the nursery knowledge would have complicated, in the picture of the family's formation that exists in the record, and that the person who best understood that formation chose not to complete. She chose not to complete it. The choosing was consistent. The consistency was itself the thing. Charles became king on the 8th of September 2022, the day his mother died at Balmoral. He was 73 years old. He had been heir to the throne for 70 years, longer than any heir in British history, longer than most people live, long enough that the waiting itself had become the defining condition of his public existence, in ways that the accession, when it finally came, could not immediately resolve. The man who became king had been formed across a lifetime that contained more difficulty and more public scrutiny than any preparation for a role can fully account for. The schools that had been chosen for him, the naval career, the marriage that had become the most publicly documented marital failure in the history of the institution, the decades of public uncertainty about whether the monarchy he was going to inherit would survive in the form he had been prepared to lead, the sustained public comparison to his mother, whose particular quality of constitutional steadiness had set a standard for the role that any successor would have found difficult to match. He carried all of it into the accession, and what he carried it with was the specific quality of character that the nursery years had preserved against the institutional pressure to correct it, the sensitivity, the genuine emotional intelligence, the capacity for the kind of engaged human connection that the palace's formation had consistently misread as weakness, and that the king's subsequent conduct in the role has expressed as a distinctive quality of attention to the people he encounters. The sensitivity that the palace had wanted corrected in the 8-year-old who left for Cheam School in 1957 is visible in the 73-year-old who became king in 2022. It is visible in the specific way he inhabits public occasions, the quality of attention he pays to the individual people he meets within the ceremonial framework, the capacity for genuine engagement with the human beings behind the public roles they are performing in his presence, the willingness to be visibly moved by things that move him in contexts where the institutional formation would have preferred the management of feeling over its expression. These qualities were not produced by the formation that the palace intended for him. They were preserved from the formation that Mabel Anderson provided in the nursery during the years before the palace's intended formation was applied. The preservation was not dramatic. It did not require her to make any formal stand against the institutional approach, or to position herself in explicit opposition to what Philip's values or the school system's orthodoxies were producing. It required only what she provided, the daily quality of an environment that treated Charles's specific character as a legitimate thing rather than as a problem requiring solution. The distance between treating someone's character as legitimate and treating it as a problem is the distance between the nursery and everything else in Charles's formation. And that distance is where the specific quality of what Mabel Anderson did for him lives. She did not build his character. She did not provide him with qualities he did not already possess. She kept the qualities he possessed from being corrected out of him in the years when correction was most available to the institutional forces that wanted to apply it. The keeping was the contribution. Its magnitude is visible in the king he became. Anne became Princess Royal in 1987, an honor that acknowledged what her decades of charitable and official work had produced. A public record of sustained, unglamorous, genuinely committed service to the causes she had engaged with and to the institution she served. The specific quality of that service, the directness, the refusal of sentimentality, the insistence on practical engagement over ceremonial display, is the quality that Mabel had observed in the nursery from Anne's earliest years, and had managed with the specific attention that Anne's particular character required. The adult Anne is recognizably continuous with the child Anne that Mabel knew in the nursery. The robustness is the same, the directness is the same. The preference for doing over appearing that characterized Anne's relationship to the nursery world found its adult expression in the preference for genuine engagement over the managed accessibility that royal public life often substitutes for it. The continuity is the nursery's legible trace in the adult, the character that was formed in those early years, expressing itself across the decades of adult life in the specific ways that early formation always expresses itself. Andrew and Edward present more complicated pictures in the sense that their adult lives have produced more complicated public narratives. Andrew through the specific set of associations and judgments that the decades of his adult choices have produced. Edward through the various adjustments and readjustments of his public role that the decades since the nursery have required. Neither is the simple outcome of early formation alone. Both carry, in the specific dimensions of their characters that are consistent across the decades of public observation, the legible traces of the nursery world that Mabel managed, and the specific qualities of attention that she brought to each of them individually. The traces are not neat, and they are not uniform, and they do not resolve into a clean narrative about the nursery's determining influence on four specific adults. Human beings are not simple outputs of early formation. They are complex products of early formation and subsequent experience, and the specific choices they make in response to both. And the nursery's contribution to what each of the four children became is inseparable from everything that followed it, without being reducible to it. What is separable, and what the accounts of people who knew the four children across the span of their lives, from nursery to adulthood, consistently confirm, is that the nursery was a genuine positive in the formation of all four, that Mabel Anderson's specific management of the specific children she was given produced outcomes that were better, in the dimension of character formation, than the institutional context surrounding the nursery would have produced without her particular contribution. Better is a word that requires specification, and the specification is more genuinely human. The risk that the formation of royal children in the mid-20th century ran was the risk of producing people whose public competence was adequate and whose inner life was diminished, people who could perform the role without being fully present in it, whose character had been shaped toward the role's requirements at the expense of the specific human qualities that make the performance of any role genuinely meaningful rather than simply competent. Mabel's contribution reduced this risk for the four children she raised. It did not eliminate it. The institutional forces that surrounded the nursery were powerful, and their effects on the children across the years of formation that followed the nursery were real. But the nursery years produced in each child a foundation of genuine character that the subsequent formation built upon rather than replaced, and the foundation was Mabel's work. Charles's accession to the throne in 2022 was also, in a sense that the formal historical record will not easily accommodate, a vindication of what Mabel had preserved in the nursery in 1950s, the evidence that the specific qualities she had protected against the institutional pressure to correct them were qualities that the king's role could use, and that the king in whom they had been preserved could bring to it. The sensitivity, the emotional intelligence, the capacity for genuine human connection, these are the qualities that the early accounts of his kingship have identified as distinguishing his engagement with the role from the more contained version of monarchical conduct that the previous reign had established as its standard. Whether the king he is makes adequate use of those qualities, whether the reign he is conducting uses the specific gifts that the nursery preserved in ways that the institution and the people it serves will eventually recognize as valuable, these are questions that the reign's own unfolding will eventually answer. What is not a question, for anyone who has followed the formation that produced him from its beginning, is where those gifts came from, and who preserved them during the years when their preservation was most at risk. Mabel Anderson was 95 years old when Charles became king. She had been in the royal family's orbit since before his birth. She had watched him across the 73 years of his life with the specific quality of attention that genuine knowledge of a person from infancy produces. The knowledge that sees the adult's specific character as the fully realized version of the child's specific character. That recognizes the continuity beneath the surface changes that decades of life and experience produce, that holds the nursery child and the king as the same person, rather than as successive versions of someone the passage of time has transformed into someone new. She was not at the accession ceremony. She was not part of the formal events that marked the transition from the previous reign to the current one. She was not mentioned in the coverage of the accession in any way that brought her name to the attention of people who were not already familiar with her connection to the family's history. She was where she had always been, inside the family's world in the specific way that 50 years of intimate service creates, held within the private relationship that the nursery had produced, and that the decades since had sustained, known to the people who mattered in the specific way that matters most, and unknown to the public record in the specific way that genuine service to private people in private contexts always leaves the servant unknown. The king she helped make became king. She was 95. The nursery was 70 years behind them both. The character formed in those years was standing in front of the country. She had been there at the beginning of it. The histories of the British monarchy, written across the second half of the 20th century, share a structural feature that is so consistent it has ceased to be noticed as a feature and has become simply the shape of how the history is told. They are histories of the monarchs and the consorts and the senior family members and the politicians and the courtiers and the private secretaries, the people whose roles the institutional structure recognizes as significant and whose significance the institutional record was therefore designed to document. The people who raised the monarchs are not in those histories. They are in the footnotes, occasionally, in the brief biographical passages that establish the context for the childhoods of the people the histories are actually about. A name, a title, a sentence confirming that the person existed and performed the function they were employed to perform. Then the history moves on to the people it considers its real subjects. Mabel Anderson is in the footnotes. The footnote treatment is not an accident of archival availability. It is not the case that the material for a fuller account of her contribution does not exist, and that the historians who wrote the histories would have included it if they had found it. The material exists in the form of the accounts of people who observed the nursery during the years of her service, in the diplomatic records that describe the royal household during this period, in the recollections of the people who worked alongside her, and in the statements of the adults that the nursery's children became. The material has not been assembled into a full account because the people who write histories of the monarchy have not identified the nursery's contribution to the monarchy's history as something that warrants the assembly. The failure of identification is the failure of a historical practice that mirrors the institutional blindness that produced it, the same indifference to formative work that allowed the palace to leave the nursery unmonitored across 17 years of the most consequential child formation in the institution's recent history, has produced a historical tradition that leaves the nursery unexamined across the decades of the scholarship that has attempted to understand what the institution is and how it produced the people who have led it. The connection between the institutional indifference and the historical tradition is not coincidental. The historical tradition works primarily from the institutional record, from the documents, the official accounts, the formal communications that the institution's operation produces and that the institution's archive preserves. What the institution considered worth documenting is what the tradition has to work from, and the institution did not consider the nursery worth documenting in any form that would have made the documentation available to subsequent scholarship. The result is a history of the modern British monarchy that knows a great deal about the formal decisions and the public events and the constitutional developments and the political relationships that constituted the monarchy's official life across the second half of the 20th century. And that knows almost nothing about the specific daily experiences and the specific human relationships and the specific quality of the formation that produced the people who made those decisions and navigated those events and inhabited those relationships. Mabel Anderson's absence from that history is the most visible expression of what the history is missing. She is the person whose contribution to the institution's history was most direct and most formative, whose daily work in the nursery produced, over 17 years, the specific characters of the four people who would carry the institution into the second half of the 20th century and the early decades of the 21st. And she is the person whose absence from the historical record is most complete and most clearly the product of a deliberate institutional blindness, rather than an accidental archival gap. The deliberate character of the blindness is visible in its consistency. It is not the case that the institutional record contains occasional acknowledgements of the nursery's significance, and that those acknowledgements have simply not been picked up by the historical tradition. The institutional record contains almost nothing about the nursery's significance, because the institution never developed a framework for understanding the nursery as significant in the ways that the historical record requires significance to be understood, as something that produced identifiable consequences that can be traced and attributed and assessed. The consequences are there. They are in the characters of the four adults that the nursery produced, and they are visible to anyone who pays sufficient attention to the specific qualities of those characters and asks the question that the historical tradition has not consistently asked. Where did these specific qualities come from, and what in the formation of these specific people produced them? The answer requires engaging with the nursery, and engaging with the nursery requires engaging with Mabel Anderson, and engaging with Mabel Anderson requires the acknowledgement that the person who raised the Queen's children was a person whose contribution to the institution's history was significant enough to be worth examining, which is the acknowledgement that the institutional blindness was specifically designed to prevent the institution from having to make. She is 95 years old, if she is still alive. The public record of her existence in the years since the active period of her service is sufficiently sparse that the current state of her life has not been established in any source available to this account. The sparseness is itself a document of the institutional treatment that her entire career exemplifies. The person whose contribution was most significant at the most intimate level of the institution's operation is also the person about whom the least can be established in the public record, because the public record was built by the institution, and the institution had no interest in building a record of her. What remains of her in the public record is the name and the role and the medal and the occasional reference in the accounts of the royal children's childhood that treat her as a biographical detail rather than as a subject. What exists beyond the public record is the contribution, visible in the characters of the adults she formed, traceable in the specific qualities of the king she helped produce, present in the sustained private relationships that the children maintained with her across the decades of their adult lives as the evidence of what the relationship had meant. The historical accounting that her contribution deserves has not been produced. This account is not that accounting. It is too brief, too general, too dependent on the secondary sources that the institutional record's limitations have made the only available material. The full accounting would require access to the private accounts of the people who knew her and who were formed by her across the decades of the nursery and beyond it, and those accounts have been maintained with the same discretion that Mabel herself maintained across 50 years of service. The discretion is the final irony of the story, the quality that made her contribution possible, the specific capacity to hold intimate knowledge of intimate people without deploying it for any purpose other than the people's own good, is also the quality that has made the full accounting of her contribution impossible. The people who could most completely describe what she gave to the family she raised are the people who understood most deeply that the describing would require a violation of the specific value that the giving had expressed. So the accounting remains incomplete, the history remains partial, the footnote remains the footnote. And the king whose character she preserved against the institutional pressure to correct it stands in front of the country, carrying in the specific quality of his engagement with the world around him, the legible trace of a woman whose name most people in that country could not supply without prompting, and whose contribution to the institution they are watching was more direct and more formative than any of the officially significant figures whose names the histories have preserved. Mabel Anderson raised the King of England. The history forgot to notice. The forgetting is not the history's failure alone, it is the institution's failure, expressed through the history the institution's record made possible. The king remembers. He called her Mabel. He has called her Mabel for 70 years. The name is the acknowledgement that the institution withheld and that the child she knew gave her instead, before he became a king and after, across the entire span of a relationship, that the historical record has treated as a footnote and that the man himself has treated as something considerably more significant than that. The man knows what the record does not contain. The man is the record, the living evidence of what was done in that nursery across 17 years, by a woman the history forgot, whose forgetting is the institution's most complete expression of the specific blindness that has always prevented it from seeing clearly the people who make it possible. She raised the King of England. She called him Charles. He called her Mabel. That exchange, 50 years of it, across the nursery and the schools and the marriages and the crises and the accession, is the only record that matters and the only record that the history will never fully contain. It is enough. It was always enough. The institution's failure to acknowledge it changes what we know about the institution. It changes nothing about what she did. The royal household's relationship with the women who cared for its children across the 20th century is a relationship whose pattern is visible only when you step back far enough from any individual case to see the whole. When you look not at any single nanny's tenure, but at the sequence of appointments and departures, and the specific conditions that each produced. And when you ask the question that the institutional record has never formally asked, what distinguished the appointments that worked from the appointments that did not? And what does the distinction tell you about what royal children actually need from the people who care for them? The answer to that question is an answer about Mabel Anderson, arrived at obliquely, through the comparison that her 50 years of successful service creates with every other appointment the palace made before and after her. She is legible as exceptional only against the background of what the institution's other choices produced, and the background is more illuminating than the institutional record has ever chosen to acknowledge. Helen Lightbody arrived at the royal household in 1948 as the senior nanny, recommended through the aristocratic network that the palace drew on for domestic appointments of significance. She was a woman of professional competence and personal rigidity, the rigidity being, in the assessment of people who worked in the household during her tenure, not a character flaw, but a professional style that had served her well in previous positions, and that she applied to the royal nursery with the same consistency she had brought to those positions. The style was the style of a certain kind of British nursery culture, authoritative, structured, more focused on the correct management of children's behavior than on the specific quality of the individual child's inner life. Children, in this approach, had needs that were met through routine and structure and the correct application of professional knowledge, and the correct application produced correct outcomes. Children who were managed within appropriate boundaries and who developed the self-regulation that the management was designed to produce. The approach was not wrong. It was the approach that the dominant childcare orthodoxy of the late 1940s supported, and its application in hundreds of nurseries across Britain was producing children who grew up perfectly adequately within the framework it established. The question was not whether the approach was wrong in general, but whether it was right for these specific children, for Charles in particular, whose specific character required from the nursery something that the rigidity of Lightbody's approach was not calibrated to provide. The accounts of Charles's relationship with Lightbody, reconstructed from the recollections of people present for it, describe a relationship of professional correctness rather than personal warmth, a relationship in which the management of the child was conducted competently without producing the specific experience of being known that Charles's character most needed. Lightbody managed Charles. Mabel knew him. The distinction produced different outcomes in the children who experienced each relationship across the years, that the two women's tenures overlapped. Lightbody's departure in 1956 was managed without public explanation, in the way that departures from royal household positions are always managed, with the institutional discretion that protects the palace from any public accounting of why the relationship ended and on whose initiative. The accounts of people close to the household during this period suggest that the departure was not straightforwardly voluntary, that there were dimensions of the nursery's operation that had produced, over the years of the overlap between Lightbody's senior position and Mabel's junior one, a dynamic whose resolution required the departure of one of the two women. The dynamic was the dynamic that any institutional environment produces when two people with fundamentally different approaches to the same work occupy the same professional space. Not open conflict, not the dramatic confrontation that produces clear winners and losers, but the sustained low-level friction of divergent professional philosophies operating in proximity without either party having the authority or the inclination to formally address the divergence. Lightbody's authority was formal and was exercised in the ways that formal authority is exercised, through the setting of standards, the management of the nursery's routine, the direction of the junior staff including Mabel. Mabel's authority was informal and was exercised in the ways that informal authority is exercised, through the quality of her relationship with the children, through the specific responsiveness of her daily management of them, through the accumulation of the children's trust that daily intimate contact produces and that formal authority cannot replicate or override. When the children's attachment to Mabel became visible enough that it could not be managed simply as the appropriate fondness of charges toward a carer, the institutional dynamic required a resolution. The resolution the palace produced was Lightbody's departure, not because the palace had assessed the relative merits of the two approaches and determined that Mabel's was superior, but because the practical reality of the nursery's operation had produced a situation in which the formal hierarchy and the functional reality had diverged so completely that the formal hierarchy required adjustment. The adjustment was made without the institutional examination that it warranted. The palace did not ask, in the wake of Lightbody's departure, what the experience of the transition had revealed about what the nursery's children needed, or about the specific qualities that distinguished effective royal childcare from its less effective alternatives. It made the personnel change and returned its attention to the formal operations that constituted its primary concern. The subsequent appointments to the royal nursery, for Andrew and Edward in the 1960s, for William and Harry in the 1980s, for the generation of royal grandchildren that followed, were made without the benefit of any institutional assessment of what Mabel's success had demonstrated about what the children needed. The palace had no mechanism for converting the evidence of one appointment's success into the criteria for subsequent appointments, because the palace had no mechanism for understanding the nursery's work as something that produced identifiable outcomes whose production required identifiable qualities in the people doing the work. Barbara Barnes, who was appointed as primary nanny to William and Harry in 1982, was a woman whose approach to childcare reflected the period's evolved assumptions, less formally rigid than Lightbody's approach, more aligned with the changing orthodoxies of the 1980s about what children needed from their carers and what the relationship between nanny and child should look like. She was selected by Diana, whose strong views about her children's care and whose resistance to the institutional protocols that had governed the previous generation's formation produced a selection process that was more parent-directed than the appointments of the 1950s had been. Barnes brought genuine warmth to the role. The accounts of people who observed her relationship with William and Harry in the early years describe a nanny who was more personally accessible than the formal models of the previous generation and who was calibrated to Diana's preference for a less institutionalized approach to the children's management. What she did not bring, and what the subsequent pattern of the relationship made apparent, was the specific quality of sustained, consistent, long-term commitment to the same family that had been the foundation of Mabel's contribution. Barnes left in 1987, when William was 5 and Harry was 3. The departure was accompanied by the specific dimension of public attention that Diana's presence in the household made unavoidable. The press coverage of Barnes's departure, and the speculation about the reasons for it, produced the kind of visibility that the nursery appointments of the 1950s had never generated. The visibility itself tells you something about the changed character of royal childcare in the 1980s. The nursery that had operated in institutional invisibility under Mabel's management was, in the decade of Diana's public prominence, a space whose operations the press considered newsworthy. The departure produced in William and Harry the specific disruption that the departure of a primary carer produces in young children, a disruption whose significance the palace's institutional indifference to the nursery's process had not equipped it to manage with the care that the disruption warranted. William was 5, Harry was 3. The woman who had been the primary constant of their daily lives for the entirety of their conscious experience was gone, and the institutional response was a new appointment, Olga Powell, who took over the primary nanny role and who brought her own qualities to the position. Powell was with the boys for several years, and the accounts of her relationship with them describe a genuine and caring connection. She was present through the years of the Wales marriage's most acute difficulties, through the separations and the press coverage, and the specific quality of domestic instability that the marriage's public dissolution produced in the household where William and Harry were growing up. The presence of a stable professional carer in this context was valuable, and Powell provided it. What the comparison with Mabel's tenure reveals is not that Powell was inadequate, she was not, but that the specific quality of sustained, decades-long commitment to the same family's children that had been the foundation of Mabel's contribution was not a quality that the subsequent appointments produced or were designed to produce. The palace's appointment process had no mechanism for identifying continuity as a value to be specifically sought, because the palace had no understanding of what the continuity that Mabel's tenure had produced was worth. The nannies of subsequent generations came and went with a frequency that contrasted sharply with Mabel's 50-year connection to the family. The contrast is not simply a biographical detail, it is a document of what was lost when the specific quality of Mabel's commitment ceased to be available to the children who came after the 4 she raised. What was lost was the specific experience of being known over time, the experience of having a person in your daily world whose knowledge of you is built on years of daily observation rather than months, whose understanding of who you are is not the fresh assessment of a new relationship, but the accumulated certainty of sustained familiarity. Children who receive this experience from the people who care for them have access to something that no subsequent relationship can fully replicate. The experience of being known in the specific way that only time and sustained attention produce. Charles had it. His children had it less. His grandchildren had it less still. The progressive diminishment of that experience across the generations is visible in the progressive difficulty of the family's internal relationships across the same generations, and the connection between the two is not one that any single factor can explain, but it is also not one that honest examination can ignore. The institution never examined it. The institution made its appointments and managed its departures, and continued its operations with the efficiency that institutional continuity always produces, and the blindness that institutional indifference to formative work always creates. Mabel Anderson remains the exception, whose exceptionality the institution never understood well enough to replicate. The failure to understand it is the palace's most consequential nursery decision, not any specific appointment, not any specific departure, but the sustained refusal to examine what the 50 years of one woman's service had demonstrated about what the institution's children most needed and how the institution could provide it. The examination would have required the palace to acknowledge that the nursery mattered. The acknowledgement was never made. The children paid the price of its absence in ways that the decades of the family's subsequent history have made available for anyone willing to trace. There is a specific kind of emotional wound that does not announce itself at the time of its production. It does not present as a crisis, or a breakdown, or a visible rupture in the surface of a person's functioning. It accumulates instead across the years of childhood, in the specific form of an absence, the absence of something that the child needed and did not receive, whose absence was not dramatic enough to be identified as damage while it was occurring, and whose consequences only become visible when the adult who carries it encounters the specific conditions that make the absence's effects apparent. William and Harry carry this wound in different ways and have expressed it through different choices in their adult lives, but the wound itself is the same wound, the wound of a childhood that was too disrupted, too public, too subject to the competing forces of a palace at war with itself, and a marriage dissolving under press coverage, and a mother whose genuine love for her children coexisted with her own unmanaged needs, to provide the specific experience of sustained, stable, deeply attentive care that the nursery years require from the people who conduct them. They did not have Mabel Anderson. This is not a statement about the specific individuals who cared for them. It is a statement about the specific quality of what Mabel's 50-year commitment to the same family had produced, and what the absence of an equivalent commitment produced in the generation that followed. They had carers who were competent and warm, and genuinely engaged with their well-being. They did not have the specific experience of being known over time by someone whose knowledge of them was built on the kind of sustained, daily, decades-long intimacy that had been the foundation of the nursery that formed Charles and his siblings. The difference between having that experience and not having it is the difference that the adult lives of the two generations make visible. Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward were formed within the specific stability that Mabel's continuity provided, a stability that existed independently of the parents' own stability, that did not fluctuate with the marriage's condition or the public schedule's demands, that was simply there, daily, as the consistent background against which the children's characters developed. Whatever difficulties the formation produced, and it produced real difficulties, particularly for Charles, it produced them against a background of nursery stability that the difficulties did not penetrate. William and Harry were formed against a different background. The Wales marriage was deteriorating from William's earliest years and had collapsed publicly by the time Harry was 8. The household they grew up in was not the household of two parents navigating the institutional constraints of royal life together. It was the household of two people conducting a separation inside the palace walls, managing their children's experience of that separation with the genuine love each bore for them and the specific inadequacy that genuine love, operating inside the conditions the marriage produced, could not fully address. Diana's approach to William and Harry was defined by the determination that her own childhood's disruptions had produced, the determination to give her sons what the disruptions had denied her, the consistent physical warmth and emotional presence that she had needed and had not always had. The determination was real and produced real differences in how the boys experienced their mother relative to how Charles had experienced his. But determination operating inside institutional constraints that did not yield to it was determination that could not fully deliver what it intended, and the gaps that the constraints produced in Diana's availability were gaps that the changing parade of nursery staff could not fill with the specific continuity that filling them required. William developed, across the years of his childhood and adolescence, the specific coping strategy that children in disrupted households often develop, a heightened attentiveness to the emotional states of the people around him, a capacity for reading the room that went beyond normal social perceptiveness and that had been sharpened by the specific conditions of a childhood in which the room's emotional weather was sufficiently variable that monitoring it had survival value. He became, in the language of the psychological literature on children raised in emotionally turbulent households, a child who managed his environment rather than simply inhabiting it. The managing produced competence, a specific kind of interpersonal intelligence, a social fluency, an ability to navigate complex emotional situations that the years of practice had made genuine. It also produced the specific cost that managing always produces in people who learned it too young and in circumstances where it was genuinely necessary, the difficulty of inhabiting a relationship without simultaneously monitoring and managing it, the specific challenge of being present in the unguarded way that genuine intimacy requires, when the habits of guardedness were formed in conditions where guardedness was necessary for self-protection. Harry's experience of the same household produced a different response. The younger child's relationship to family disruption is different from the older child's. The younger arrives into circumstances that the older has already begun to adapt to, inherits the family's emotional weather as an existing condition rather than watching it develop, and has less opportunity to construct the adaptive strategies that the older child develops through the process of watching the disruption emerge. Harry was 3 when Barnes left. He was 8 when his parents formally separated. He was 12 when Diana died. The death of Diana, when Harry was 12, is the event that the accounts of his adult difficulties most consistently return to as the formative rupture, the loss that was not adequately processed in childhood, that was managed within the specific constraints of a royal family's management of public grief, and that left in him a wound whose dimensions, the subsequent decades of his life, have expressed in ways that the people around him have not always understood, and that he has not always had the tools to explain. The inadequate processing was not simply the product of the death's specific circumstances, though the circumstances, the Paris tunnel, the global scale of the public grief, the specific quality of a family trying to manage personal loss inside the full visibility of the world's attention, were circumstances that made adequate processing genuinely difficult. It was also the product of the absence, in Harry's childhood, of the specific kind of sustained, deeply knowing relationship with a consistent carer that might have provided, in the years before the death and in the years immediately after it, a stable reference point against which the disruption could be measured and the loss could be processed. Charles had Mabel. When the disruptions of his childhood arrived, the school departures, the institutional pressures, the specific difficulties of his relationship with Philip, they arrived against the background of the nursery's stability, and the stability provided the reference point that disruption requires to be understood as disruption, rather than experienced as the total condition of existence. The nursery had shown him, through the quality of Mabel's daily presence, what sustained, attentive care felt like, had given him an embodied knowledge of what that experience was, against which the disruptions were legible as departures from a norm that the nursery had established. Harry had no equivalent reference point. The carers of his early years were warm and competent and genuinely present, but they came and went with a frequency that prevented the kind of sustained, accumulated knowing that Mabel's relationship with Charles had produced. The norm against which Harry could measure his experience was not the stability of a Mabel-like relationship, but the variability of an early childhood that contained genuine love and genuine disruption in proportions that the variability itself prevented from settling into anything stable enough to serve as a reference. When Diana died, Harry lost not only his mother, but the primary source of the specific warmth and attentiveness that his childhood had contained. The loss was therefore not simply the loss of a parent, devastating enough in any circumstances, but the loss of the person who had provided most of what the sustained, attentive care that the nursery years require had looked like in his specific experience. The devastation of the loss was proportional to the centrality of what was lost, and what was lost was central in ways that the absence of a Mabel-equivalent figure in his formation had made more rather than less central. The adult Harry who spoke to Oprah Winfrey in March 2021, who described the experience of walking behind his mother's coffin at the age of 12 and the instruction to hold his emotions in check for the cameras, who described the years of unprocessed grief and the mental health difficulties that the years had accumulated, was describing the specific consequences of a childhood that had contained too little of the sustained, knowing, consistent care that the nursery years require, and too much of the disruption that the absence of adequate provision for that care had left unmitigated. He was also, without knowing it, describing the specific gap that Mabel Anderson's absence from his formation had left. Not Mabel herself, whom he barely knew, but the specific quality of what Mabel had represented in the formation of the generation before him, the sustained presence, the knowledge built on time, the stability that did not fluctuate with the marriage's condition or the public schedule's demands, the experience of being known completely by someone whose knowing was built on the specific, daily, unremarkable intimacy of a nursery. William has spoken about mental health with a public commitment that reflects, in its specific character, the specific coping strategy his childhood produced, the managing, the monitoring, the attentiveness to the people around him that his formation had made necessary and that his adult role has made publicly useful. He campaigns for mental health awareness from the position of someone who understands the value of addressing what was not addressed in his own formation, whose public advocacy is shaped by the private knowledge of what the absence of adequate support for the inner life produces in the people who grow up without it. Both of them are saying, in the different languages available to each of them, something about what the formation of royal children requires and what the palace's provision for that formation has historically failed to provide with the consistency and the quality that the requirement deserves. They are saying it from the adult position of men who experienced the failure's consequences, who grew up in the gap between what the nursery should have provided and what it actually provided. In the specific generation when the quality that Mabel Anderson had embodied for 17 years in the nursery was no longer available to the children who needed it. The palace has not heard the saying in those terms. The palace does not hear things in terms that require it to examine its own formative failures. It hears them in the terms that are available to it, as individual difficulties, personal struggles, the specific challenges of specific people navigating specific circumstances. The specific circumstances were produced by a specific institutional failure. The failure was the failure to understand, across the decades of the royal nursery's operation, what the nursery was for and what the people who managed it provided to the children who were formed within it. Mabel Anderson knew what the nursery was for. She knew it from the first year of her tenure, and she maintained the knowing across 50 years of daily practice. The institution she served learned nothing from the knowing because the institution never looked at the nursery long enough to see what the knowing contained. The consequences are in the public record. They have been speaking for years. The institution is still not listening in the way that listening would require it to change. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.